Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never should have gone hiking alone, but how could I have known that the Appalachian Trail would lead me straight into a nightmare? The sun was sinking behind the ridgeline as I pushed on, determined to reach the next shelter before nightfall. The autumn air had a crisp bite to it, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves. I breathed deeply, savoring the solitude and the vibrant colors painting the forest around me. That's when I first heard it, a soft crunch of leaves behind me. I paused, cocking my head to listen. Nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. Shrugging it off, I continued along the narrow dirt path, my boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. There it was again, a deliberate footfall, just as my own foot touched the ground. I whirled around, heart suddenly pounding. The trail behind me was empty, winding away through the deepening shadows of the forest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast wilderness. No response. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. I picked up my pace, the weight of my backpack suddenly feeling oppressive. The shelter couldn't be far now. With each step I took, another followed a beat later. Sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, but always just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was an echo, a trick of the terrain. But deep down, I knew better. Something was following me. The logical part of my brain ran through the possibilities. A curious deer, perhaps, but the footfalls were too heavy, too deliberate. A bear. My pulse quickened at the thought, but I hadn't seen any sign of bears in this area. Whatever this was walked on two legs, with a gait unnervingly similar to my own. As the light faded, the forest took on a menacing quality. Shadows deepened, and familiar shapes transformed into looming monsters. Every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, straining to catch a glimpse of my unseen pursuer. There was nothing there, nothing I could see, at least, but I could hear it. The footsteps grew bolder as darkness fell, no longer trying to match my own. They were getting closer. I broke into a jog, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect on the trail ahead. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, but I barely felt the sting. The footsteps behind me quickened to match my pace. A root caught my toe, and I stumbled, barely keeping my feet. As I fought to regain my balance, a low growl rumbled through the night air. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human. It raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a jolt of primal fear through my body. I ran, all thoughts of the shelter forgotten. I sprinted blindly down the trail. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but raw terror kept me moving. The thing behind me crashed through the underbrush, no longer trying to stay hidden. It was gaining on me. My foot caught on another root, and this time I went down hard. I hit the ground with a sickening thud, the taste of blood filling my mouth as I bit my tongue. Dazed, I rolled onto my back, my headlamp illuminating the canopy above. For a moment, all was silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Then a shape moved at the edge of my light's beam. Something massive shifted in the darkness just beyond my sight. I could hear its labored breathing, smell the musty odor of wet fur and decay. Slowly, I turned my head. Two eyes reflected the light, glowing an eerie yellowish green. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest creature. As my gaze adjusted, I could make out a hulking silhouette looming over me. It stood upright on two legs, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with powerful shoulders and long arms that nearly reached the ground. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature took a step closer. The details of its face were mercifully hidden in shadow, but I caught a glimpse of fangs as it opened its mouth. Another rumbling growl vibrated through my entire body. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing shouldn't exist. It was impossible, and yet here it was, all too real and only feet away from where I lay helpless on the forest floor. A scream built in my throat, but I choked it back. Some instinct told me that any sudden sound or movement would trigger an attack. So I remained motionless, scarcely daring to breathe as the monster studied me. Long seconds ticked by, feeling like an eternity. My muscles cramped from the tension of holding still, and cold sweat soaked through my clothes. I waited for the creature to pounce, to tear me apart with those massive claws I could now see glinting in the dim light. But the attack never came. Instead, the beast slowly backed away, melting into the shadows beyond my headlamp's reach. I heard the snap of branches and rustle of leaves as it moved away, the sound gradually fading into the distance. I don't know how long I lay there, straining my ears for any sign of its return. Eventually, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest resumed, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets. Still, I didn't move. The first pale light of dawn was seeping through the trees when I finally found the courage to sit up. My body protested, stiff from hours spent motionless on the cold ground. Wincing, I looked around, half expecting to see the creature watching me from behind a tree. The forest appeared normal in the grey morning light. Birds began their morning chorus, and a light mist hung between the trees. If not for the mud caked on my clothes and the lingering metallic taste of blood in my mouth, I might have convinced myself it had all been a terrible dream. But there, pressed into a patch of damp earth just beyond where I'd fallen, was a footprint. My breath caught in my throat as I crawled over to examine it. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. 5 toes splayed out from a broad pad, each ending in a deep impression left by a wicked claw. I scrambled to my feet, suddenly feeling exposed. My eyes darted around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead hours later, ignoring the burning in my legs and the stabbing pain in my side. Other hikers gave me strange looks as I burst out of the woods, wild-eyed and covered in mud. I must have looked half mad as I babbled about the creature to the startled park ranger at the visitor center. He listened patiently to my story, nodding in that way people do when they're humoring someone they think is unhinged. When I finished, he gave me a sympathetic smile. "Sounds like you had quite a scare," he said, not unkindly. "Black bears can seem mighty big when you encounter them at night, and they do sometimes stand on their hind legs, which can be pretty intimidating." I started to protest, to insist that what I'd seen was no bear, but the words died in my throat. How could I explain the footsteps that mimicked my own, the impossible height of the creature, those glowing eyes and the bone-deep terror I'd felt in its presence? In the harsh light of day, my own story sounded unbelievable to my ears. I let the ranger believe what he wanted, nodding numbly as he gave me a lecture on hiking safety and the importance of making noise to avoid startling wildlife. As I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it had been a bear, my fear-addled mind exaggerating its features in the darkness. Or perhaps I'd fallen and hit my head, the whole encounter nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The image of those glowing eyes was burned into my memory. The sound of that growl still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been allowed to leave, that the creature had chosen to let me go for reasons I couldn't fathom. I've never gone hiking alone again. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I wake in a cold sweat, convinced I hear footsteps creeping closer. In my dreams, I'm back on that moonlit trail, running from something I can't see but know is there, and always, in the back of my mind, is the certainty that somewhere out in those ancient mountains, something is waiting, watching. I just pray our paths never cross again. Story 2. Jesus Christ, I muttered, staring at the mangled carcass before us. What was left of the deer lay scattered across the forest floor, its innards strewn about like gory tinsel. This was no ordinary predator kill. My partner, Sarah, crouched next to the remains, her face grim. Third one this week. Jack, whatever's doing this, it's getting bolder. I nodded, scanning the surrounding trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. As park rangers, Sarah and I had seen our fair share of animal attacks, but nothing like this. The sheer violence of the kills, the way the bodies were torn apart, it was unsettling to say the least. "Let's check for tracks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we can finally figure out what we're dealing with." We spread out, searching the soft earth around the kill site. The ground was damp from recent rain, perfect for preserving prints. It didn't take long to find them. "Jack!" Sarah called out. "Over here!" I jogged over to where she stood, staring at the ground with a puzzled expression. As soon as I saw the tracks, I understood why. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot. 5 toes splayed out from a broad pad, each ending in a deep claw mark. But it wasn't just the size that was alarming. The shape was all wrong, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "What the hell made these?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head, at a loss for words. The tracks were vaguely humanoid, but no human could leave prints like this, and they were too large and oddly shaped to belong to any bear or mountain lion. "Let's follow them," I said, surprising myself with the suggestion. Every instinct screamed at me to radio for backup and get the hell out of there, but curiosity and a sense of duty won out. Whatever was killing these deer, we needed to find it before it decided to start hunting bigger prey. Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to the tranquilizer gun at her hip. We both carried them, along with sidearms for emergencies. I had a feeling we might need more than tranks before this was over. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from the established trails. We moved cautiously, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves setting our nerves on edge. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. As we walked, I noticed other signs that something wasn't right. Claw marks gouged into tree trunks, far higher than a bear could reach. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on low-hanging branches. And always, that nagging sensation of being watched. We'd been following the trail for about an hour when we heard it, a sharp crack echoing through the trees, like a massive branch being snapped in two. Sarah and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. Another crack followed, then another. A pattern emerged, 2 quick sounds followed by a pause, then repeated. It was deliberate, almost like wood knocking, Sarah breathed, voicing my own realization. I'd heard the stories from other rangers and seasoned hikers, strange knocking sounds in remote areas, often attributed to Bigfoot by believers. I'd always scoffed at the idea. Now, hearing it with my own ears, a chill ran down my spine. "It's got to be some kind of territorial display," I said, trying to cling to a rational explanation. "And there may be a new bear behavior we haven't documented yet." Sarah gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it, but she nodded anyway. Should we try to get closer to the source? Part of me wanted to say no, to turn back while we still could, but we'd come this far. "Yeah," I said, swallowing hard, "but let's approach quietly. Keep your trank gun ready." We crept forward, moving as silently as possible through the underbrush. The knocking grew louder, interspersed now with low grunts and the sound of branches being pushed aside. Whatever was making the noise, it was big. Suddenly, the forest ahead of us fell silent. The abrupt absence of sound was almost as unnerving as the knocking had been. Sarah and I paused, straining our ears for any hint of movement. That's when we saw it. A massive, hair-covered figure stepped out from behind a towering boulder about 50 yards ahead of us. It moved with an eerie grace for its size, bipedal but with a gait unlike any human's. As it turned its head, scanning the forest, I caught a glimpse of a face that sent ice through my veins, a bizarre blend of ape-like and almost human features, with eyes that reflected a disturbing intelligence. Sarah let out a small gasp beside me. The creature's head snapped in our direction, its nostrils flaring as it scented the air. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other across the clearing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every story I'd ever heard about Bigfoot, every blurry photo and implausible encounter suddenly seemed far more plausible. The spell was broken when Sarah's radio crackled to life, an incoming message shattering the silence. The creature's eyes widened, and it let out a bone-shaking roar that hit me like a physical force. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and yanking her backward. We took off through the woods, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear the monster giving chase, its powerful strides easily keeping pace. "The Tranks!" Sarah shouted between gasping breaths. I'd completely forgotten about the gun at my hip. Fumbling with the holster as I ran, I managed to draw the weapon, but when I risked a glance over my shoulder to aim, my foot caught on an exposed root. I went down hard, the gun flying from my hand. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to scramble back to my feet. Sarah skidded to a stop, rushing back to help me. "Go!" I yelled at her. "To get out of here!" She ignored me, grabbing my arm to haul me up, but we both knew it was too late. Heavy footsteps approached, and a shadow fell over us. Slowly, we turned to face the creature. It towered over us, easily 8 feet tall, its massive chest heaving with exertion. This close, the smell was overpowering, a musky animal odor mixed with something eerily human. I pushed Sarah behind me for all the good it would do. My mind raced, trying to remember the proper procedure for aggressive wildlife encounters, but this was so far beyond anything we'd been trained for. To my amazement, the creature didn't attack. It stood there, studying us with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. After a moment, it raised one huge, hair-covered hand and pointed at Sarah's radio. I think it wants the radio," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Moving slowly, telegraphing her movements, Sarah unclipped the radio from her belt. The creature watched intently as she held it out. With surprising gentleness, it took the radio in its massive hand. It turned the device over, examining it from all angles, occasionally glancing at us as if to make sure we weren't going to try anything. Finally, it raised the radio to its mouth and pressed the talk button. A series of guttural sounds emerged, not quite speech, but more complex than animal noises. It listened to the static response, then tried again, this time producing a sound uncannily like the squelch of the radio. I exchanged a bewildered look with Sarah. Was it mimicking the radio sounds? The creature seemed to grow frustrated with the unresponsive device. With a grunt, it tossed the radio aside and focused its attention back on us. For a long moment, we stood in a silent standoff. I could feel Sarah trembling beside me, but to her credit, she didn't run. Maybe she realized, as I did, that any sudden movement could trigger an attack. Then, to my utter astonishment, the creature slowly extended its hand toward me, palm up. The gesture was unmistakable. It wanted to shake hands. Every instinct screamed at me not to do it, to turn and run. But some deeper part of me recognized the importance of this moment. Heart pounding, I reached out and placed my hand in its enormous palm. The creature's grip was firm but not crushing. It shook my hand once, almost formally, then released me and stepped back. With one last, long look at both of us, it turned and melted into the forest, vanishing among the trees with surprising speed for its size. Sarah and I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Finally, she broke the silence. "Jack," she said quietly, "what the hell do we put in our report?" I let out a shaky laugh, the absurdity of the situation hitting me all at once. I have no idea, but I don't think anyone would believe us if we told them the truth. As we made our way back to the ranger station, limping and shell-shocked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just experienced something profound. We'd encountered a legend, a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. And in that brief moment of connection, I'd seen something in its eyes, a spark of recognition, of shared understanding. Whatever that thing was, it was far more than just an animal, and I had a feeling our paths would cross again someday. Story 3. I never believed in monsters until I saw one through my camera lens. Now, I can't unsee it. The crisp autumn air nipped at my exposed skin as I trudged through the underbrush, my backpack heavy with camera gear. Golden hour was approaching, and I was determined to capture the perfect shot of nocturnal wildlife emerging at dusk. As a wildlife photographer, I'd spent countless nights in the wilderness, patiently waiting for that magical moment when nature revealed its hidden wonders. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to witness in the depths of the Ozark National Forest. I found a promising spot near a small clearing, the remnants of an old logging road now reclaimed by nature. Setting up my blind was second nature after years of practice. I nestled into the camouflaged shelter, my camera at the ready, and settled in for a long night of observation. The forest came alive as darkness fell. An owl hooted in the distance, and I caught glimpses of small mammals scurrying through the leaf litter. My shutter clicked softly as I captured fleeting moments, the luminous eyes of a raccoon, the graceful leap of a deer. It wasn't until I reviewed the footage the next morning that I noticed something odd. There, in the background of a shot of a foraging opossum, was a shape I couldn't quite make out. Tall and vaguely humanoid, it stood partially obscured by a tree. I squinted at my camera's small LCD screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A trick of the light, perhaps, or maybe just an oddly shaped tree trunk. Curiosity piqued. I decided to stay another night. This time, I positioned my blind with a clear view of the area where I'd spotted the strange shape. As darkness fell on the second night, anticipation thrummed through my veins. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me flinch, but hours passed with nothing out of the ordinary appearing before my lens. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, movement caught my eye. I raised my camera, peering through the viewfinder. My breath caught in my throat. There it was again. A tall, dark figure moving with unnatural fluidity between the trees. It was too far away to make out details, but something about its proportions seemed off. Too tall, too thin to be human, yet clearly bipedal. I started snapping photos rapid fire, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give away my position. The figure paused, as if sensing it was being watched. Slowly, it turned its head in my direction. I froze, finger hovering over the shutter button. For a moment that stretched into eternity, I felt pinned by an unseen gaze. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the shadows. Sleep eluded me that night as I huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was up, reviewing the footage with trembling hands. Most of the shots were too blurry or dark to make out much detail, but in one, a single, crystal-clear frame, I could see it. A tall, humanoid shape with impossibly long limbs and a head that seemed too small for its body. Its skin, where visible, had an odd mottled texture. I stared at the image until my eyes burned, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a person in some kind of costume, right? But deep down, I knew that no human could move the way that thing had moved. Logically, I should have packed up and left right then. But the photographer in me, the part that always craved the perfect shot, wouldn't let it go. I had to know more. I had to get closer, so I stayed. Night after night, I set up my blind and waited, camera at the ready, and night after night, the figure appeared, always just at the edge of clear visibility. But something was changing. With each passing evening, the shape in my viewfinder drew nearer. It was as if it was growing bolder, or perhaps just more curious about the strange human who kept invading its territory. By the fifth night, I could make out more details. The way its joints seemed to bend at impossible angles, the eerie grace of its movements as it navigated the forest with silent ease. And its eyes, God, its eyes. In the few frames where I caught them, they reflected the light like a nocturnal animal's, gleaming with an intelligence that chilled me to my core. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and never return to these woods, but I was obsessed. I needed one more night, one perfect shot to prove to the world that this thing was real. On the seventh night, I got my wish. The forest was unnaturally quiet as I settled into my blind. No owl calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woodland was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't have to wait long. A twig snapped directly behind my blind. I whirled around, camera raised, and found myself face to face with the creature. It filled the frame of my viewfinder, a nightmare made flesh. In that frozen moment, I took in every detail I'd been craving to capture. The elongated limbs, the mottled grey-green skin that seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light. Its face was a twisted parody of human features, with sunken cheeks and a lipless mouth that revealed far too many sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that held me paralyzed. Large and liquid black, they stared directly into the camera lens with an expression that was unmistakably curious, intelligent, almost amused. My finger pressed the shutter button of its own accord. The flash went off, momentarily illuminating the creature in stark detail. It recoiled with a hiss that sounded like steam escaping a pressure valve. Before I could react, a long-fingered hand shot out, impossibly fast, and wrapped around my camera. I let out a strangled yelp as the creature yanked the camera from my grasp, taking the strap with it and nearly pulling me out of the blind. I scrambled backward, my heel catching on the edge of my camping chair. I toppled over, taking the entire blind down with me in a tangle of camouflage netting. By the time I extricated myself, the creature was gone, and so was my camera. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, every sound amplified by my frayed nerves. When dawn finally broke, I broke camp in record time and all but ran back to my car. It wasn't until I was safely home, doors locked and curtains drawn, that the full impact of what had happened hit me. I'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and now I had no proof. No one would believe me without evidence. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. Maybe it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in the blind and dreamed the whole encounter. But deep down, I knew the truth. The memory of those intelligent eyes boring into mine was too vivid, too real to be a dream. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every shadow, convinced that the creature would come for me. I pored over blurry photos of supposed cryptids on the internet, searching for anything that resembled what I'd seen. I even considered going back to the forest, but the thought alone was enough to send me into a cold sweat. Just as I was starting to think I might be losing my mind, a package arrived on my doorstep. No return address, no markings of any kind. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was my camera, slightly scratched but otherwise intact. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and scrolled through the photos. They were all gone. Every shot I'd taken over those 7 nights had been erased, all except one, the last photo. The close-up of the creature's face, its eyes staring directly into the lens. But the image had changed, superimposed over the creature's features, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a message. 3 words that made my blood run cold. No more pictures. I sold all my camera gear the next day and never set foot in those woods again. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear the snap of a twig, and I know, deep in my bones, that somewhere out there, something is watching, waiting, and remembering the human who dared to capture its image. Story 4. The howl that shattered the night wasn't from any wolf I'd ever heard. It was the sound of nightmares, of primal fears, given voice, and it was coming for us. But let me back up. My name's Mike, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. I thought I'd seen it all. Bears, mountain lions, even a wolverine once. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that ill-fated camping trip in the Adirondacks. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my buddy Chris and his girlfriend Sarah. We'd hiked deep into the backcountry, far from the well-trodden tourist paths, seeking that perfect blend of solitude and wilderness. As we set up camp in a small clearing, the late afternoon sun filtering through the canopy, I felt that familiar sense of peace settle over me. This was where I belonged, surrounded by towering pines and the sweet scent of wild blueberries. "Hey, Mike, give me a hand with this tent, will you?" Chris called out, struggling with a tangle of poles. I chuckled, moving to help. "City boy," I teased. "Thought you said you'd been practicing in your backyard?" Chris rolled his eyes. Yeah, my backyard doesn't have all these roots and rocks, smartass." Sarah, meanwhile, was gathering kindling for the fire. "Boys, play nice," she said with a grin. "Or no s'mores for either of you." We bantered back and forth as we finished setting up camp, the familiar routine a comfort in the growing twilight. By the time we had a crackling fire going and dinner cooking, stars were starting to peek out overhead. That's when things started to get weird. "Hey, guys," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Did you hear that?" Chris and I paused, listening. At first, all I could hear were the normal nighttime forest sounds, the crackle of our fire, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, too heavy to be a small animal. And was that breathing? "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Something about the quality of that sound set my nerves on edge. Chris nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Yeah, sure, deer. Let's make sure our food's secure, yeah?" We double-checked our bear bag, hoisting it high between two trees. As I turned back to the campfire, a flash of movement caught my eye. I whirled, heart pounding, but saw nothing but shadows among the trees. "You guys see that?" I asked. Sarah and Chris shook their heads, looking concerned. "Maybe we should turn in early," Sarah suggested. "It's been a long day of hiking." We agreed, dousing the fire and retreating to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on high alert. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just normal forest sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Chris's voice. "Mike! Sarah! Wake up!" I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, unzipping the tent with clumsy fingers. The pre-dawn light was grey and misty as I emerged, blinking sleep from my eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked, then stopped short as I saw Chris's face. He was pale, eyes wide with shock. "The food," he said, pointing. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Our bear bag was on the ground, shredded. Its contents were strewn across the campsite, torn open and partially eaten. "Jesus," I breathed. "What could have done this?" Sarah joined us, gasping as she saw the destruction. "A bear?" she asked, voice trembling. I shook my head slowly. "I don't think so. Look at those claw marks. They're all wrong for a bear." And they were. The gouges in the thick fabric of the bear bag were long and deep, more like knife slashes than anything an animal should have been able to produce. "Maybe we should pack up," Chris said. "Head back to the trailhead." Part of me wanted to agree, but the stubborn, outdoorsman part of my brain rebelled at the idea of being chased off by wildlife, no matter how unusual. "Let's not panic," I said. "We've still got some food in our packs. We'll just have to be extra careful tonight. Maybe take watches." Chris and Sarah exchanged a look, but nodded reluctantly. We spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease from the morning, but I couldn't help noticing how quiet the forest seemed. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels. It was as if all the wildlife had vacated the area. As we made our way back to camp that evening, the silence grew oppressive. We built up the fire higher than usual, none of us wanting to admit how comforting the light was. "I'll take first watch," I volunteered. "You guys get some sleep." They didn't argue, retreating to their tent with obvious relief. I settled in by the fire, my hunting knife close at hand. I wasn't usually one for weapons, but after last night I wasn't taking any chances. The hours crept by. Every shadow seemed to move, every breath of wind carrying phantom sounds. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, that we'd all gotten spooked over nothing. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, much closer than I was comfortable with. I stood, knife in hand, peering into the darkness beyond our firelight. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. If there was something out there, I'd just given away my position. Silence answered me, but as I turned back to the fire, movement caught my eye. I spun, heart racing. There, just at the edge of the light, stood something. It was tall, so much taller than any man. Shaggy fur covered its body, matted and unkempt, but it was the face that stopped my breath cold, a twisted amalgamation of wolf and human features, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the firelight. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every childhood nightmare, every campfire story about monsters in the woods came rushing back. Then it stepped forward into the light, and I saw its claws, long, curved things that looked capable of shredding a bear bag or a human with ease. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed, "Chris, Sarah, run!" The creature's head snapped up at my shout. It let out a snarl that turned into that bone-chilling howl I mentioned earlier, a sound that was neither fully wolf nor human, but something horrifyingly in between. Chris and Sarah burst out of their tent, taking in the scene with wide eyes. To their credit, they didn't freeze. Chris grabbed Sarah's hand and they bolted for the trees. I turned to follow, but a heavy weight slammed into my back, driving me to the ground. Hot breath washed over my neck as the thing pinned me down. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then its weight was gone. I rolled over to see Chris swinging a burning branch from the fire, driving the creature back. "Come on," he yelled, hauling me to my feet. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. We fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear the creature giving chase, its howls echoing through the trees. I lost all sense of time and direction as we ran. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Whenever we'd start to slow, another howl would sound, closer than before, spurring us on. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, we burst out onto a road, an actual paved road. I could have wept with relief. We flagged down the first car we saw, an old pickup truck driven by a very startled-looking man. He took one look at our wild eyes and torn clothes and ushered us into the bed of his truck without question. As we sped away, I risked a glance back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape standing there, watching us go. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest shadows. We never went back for our gear, never reported what happened to the rangers. Who would believe us? Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, that inhuman howl echoing in my dreams. I don't go camping anymore, and when people ask me why, I just smile and say I prefer the comforts of home these days. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world we're not meant to understand, things that lurk in the dark places, just beyond the reach of our campfires, and sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them, and they glimpse us right back. Story 5. The scream that echoed through the valley wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between, and it made my blood run cold. My name is Alex, and I've been with Search and Rescue for 5 years. I thought I'd seen it all, lost hikers, climbing accidents, even a few bear encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that mountain. It started as a routine call. A solo hiker, experienced but perhaps too confident, hadn't checked in with his emergency contact. We mobilized quickly, a team of 6 heading into the backcountry of the Cascades. The weather was turning nasty as we set out, clouds rolling in and obscuring the peaks. I shared a worried glance with Maria, our team leader. Bad weather could turn a simple rescue into a nightmare real quick. "All right, people," Maria called out as we reached the trailhead. "Fan out, standard search pattern, radio check every 15 minutes. This weather's not messing around, so stay alert." We moved into the forest, the dense undergrowth swallowing us up. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. An unnatural stillness hung over everything, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional crackle of radio static. About 2 hours in, we found the first sign of our missing hiker. A torn backpack hung from a branch, its contents scattered across the forest floor. "Over here!" I called out, crouching to examine the scene. The others gathered around, faces grim. "Jesus," breathed Tom, our newest member. "What could have done this?" The pack was shredded, long gashes ripping through the tough fabric, but it was the claw marks on the nearby tree that sent a chill down my spine. They were huge, easily as long as my forearm, and deeper than any bear claws I'd ever seen. Maria's voice was tense as she radioed it in. "Base, this is Rescue 1. We've found evidence of the missing hiker, possibly animal attack, requesting backup and animal control." Static answered her. She frowned, adjusting the radio. "Base, do you copy?" "Nothing." "Must be the weather," she muttered, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "All right. We press on, but stay close, people. I don't like this." We continued up the trail, the silence growing more oppressive with each step. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite it being midday. That's when we heard it. A low moan, almost lost in the wind, coming from a ravine to our left. "Hello!" I called out. "Search and rescue! Can you hear me?" The moan came again, louder this time. Without waiting for orders, I started scrambling down the steep slope, the others right behind me. At the bottom of the ravine, we found him. The missing hiker lay crumpled against a fallen log, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. But it was his face that stopped me cold. His eyes were wide, unfocused, darting around in terror. When he saw us, he let out a strangled cry. "No! Get away! It'll come back!" I approached slowly, hands raised. "It's okay. We're here to help. What will come back?" He shook his head violently, trying to scramble away despite his injured leg. The thing, not human, not animal. Oh God, the eyes! Maria stepped in, her voice calm and authoritative. "Sir, you're in shock. We need to get you out of here. Can you tell us if you have any other injuries?" As she spoke, I noticed something odd. Scattered around the hiker were tufts of coarse, dark hair, too long and thick to be human, too coarse for any animal I knew. I was about to point it out when a blood-curdling shriek split the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, part roar, part scream, wholly terrifying. The hiker let out a whimper and curled into a ball. "What the hell was that?" Tom's voice shook as he drew his sidearm. Maria was already in action. "And we need to move now. Tom, Alex, help me with the victim. The rest of you, cover our six." We hauled the hiker to his feet, supporting him between us as we started the arduous climb out of the ravine. The strange cry came again, closer this time, much closer, heart pounding. I risked a glance over my shoulder. At first I saw nothing but shadows among the trees. Then something moved. It was huge, whatever it was. A dark shape, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. As it stepped into a patch of weak sunlight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of limbs that seemed too long, too jointed. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest. "Move!" I yelled, no longer caring about stealth. We scrambled up the slope, half dragging the hiker with us. I could hear heavy breathing behind us, the snap of branches as something large gave chase. We reached the top of the ravine and broke into a run, making for the relative safety of the trail. The hiker was babbling incoherently now, eyes rolled back in his head. Another scream ripped through the air, so close it made my ears ring. I turned to look and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature burst from the tree line, all matted fur and impossible angles. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a twisted parody of human features stretched over an elongated skull, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow. "Oh, shit!" I heard someone whisper. Maybe it was me. "Split up!" Maria yelled. "Tom, get the victim to the rendezvous point. The rest of you scatter. Draw it away." We broke apart, running in different directions. I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear the creature's labored breathing, the thud of its footsteps. My lungs burned as I ran, legs pumping on autopilot. I knew I couldn't outrun this thing. My only hope was to lose it in the dense underbrush. I veered off the trail, crashing through a thicket of ferns. Thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the creature thrashing after me, closer with each passing second. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I had just enough time to register the edge of a cliff before I was falling, tumbling down a steep, rocky slope. I hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping. Then I heard it, that awful, inhuman shriek, coming from just above me. Ignoring the pain shooting through my body, I scrambled to my feet and dove into a narrow crevice between two boulders. I wedged myself in as far as I could go, heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by snuffling sounds. I held my breath, pressing myself against the cold stone. A shadow fell across the entrance to my hiding spot. For an eternity, nothing happened. I could hear the creature breathing, could smell its musky animal odor. Then slowly, the shadow retreated. The footsteps moved away, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I don't know how long I stayed in that crevice, shaking and trying not to make a sound. It wasn't until I heard Maria's voice calling my name that I dared to move. "Alex, can you hear me, Alex?" I crawled out of my hiding spot on trembling legs. "Here," I called weakly. "I'm here." Maria appeared at the top of the slope, relief washing over her face. "Thank God. Are you hurt?" I shook my head, then immediately regretted it as the world spun. "I'm okay. The others," her expression tightened. "Tom and the victim made it out. We lost contact with the others." My blood ran cold. "Lost contact? What do you mean?" Maria looked away. "They're just gone, Alex. No radio response, no sign of them. It's like they vanished into thin air." As if on cue, that bone-chilling shriek echoed through the valley once more. Maria and I exchanged a look of pure terror. "We need to go," she said. "Now." We made it back to base camp in record time, though every shadow seemed to hide yellow eyes and grasping claws. The authorities were called in. A massive search launched for our missing team members. They were never found. The official report cited a rogue bear attack, despite the lack of evidence. The hiker we rescued babbled about monsters for weeks before checking himself into a psychiatric facility. As for me, I quit search and rescue the next day. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that unearthly scream. And I know deep in my bones that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilization, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their domain. And God help you if you do. Story 6. The scratching at the walls wasn't the worst part. It was knowing that whatever was out there in the blizzard wanted in, and it wasn't human. My name's Jake, and I've been skiing the backcountry for over a decade. I thought I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. Turns out, there are some things you can't prepare for, no matter how experienced you are. It was supposed to be a routine overnight trip, a chance to hit some fresh powder before the tourists arrived for the season. I'd done this run a dozen times before, always solo. The solitude was part of the appeal. The weather report had mentioned a chance of snow, but nothing major. As I set out that morning, the sky was clear and blue, the sun glinting off the pristine white slopes. Perfect conditions. I made good time, carving through untouched snow and reveling in the crisp mountain air. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached my usual camping spot, a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. That's when I noticed the first signs that something was off. The wind had picked up, carrying dark clouds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The temperature was dropping fast, much faster than it should have. I've been caught in sudden squalls before, so I wasn't too worried. I decided to push on to an old trapper's cabin I knew was a few miles ahead. It would provide better shelter than my tent if the weather turned nasty. By the time I reached the cabin, visibility was down to almost nothing. The wind howled, driving snow and ice horizontally. I could barely see my hand in front of my face as I fumbled with the cabin's rusty latch. Finally, the door swung open. I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me and sagging against it in relief. The cabin was small and Spartan, just a single room with a wood stove, a rickety table, and a narrow cot. But right then, it looked like the Ritz-Carlton to me. I shrugged off my pack and got to work. Years of backcountry experience kicked in as I went through the motions, gathering what scraps of firewood I could find, melting snow for water, taking stock of my supplies. As the stove slowly warmed the cabin, I allowed myself to relax a bit. The storm was raging outside, but in here I was safe and dry. I'd wait it out, then head back down the mountain in the morning. That's when I noticed the scratches. They were on the inside of the door, long, deep gouges in the wood. At first, I thought they might be from animals trying to get in, but as I examined them closer, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The marks were too high up for any normal animal, and they weren't random. There was a pattern to them, almost like claw marks, huge claw marks. I backed away from the door, my heart suddenly pounding. What the hell could have made those? A gust of wind rattled the cabin's single window, making me jump. Get a grip, I told myself. You're letting your imagination run wild. I forced myself to focus on practical matters, eating a meager dinner of energy bars, laying out my sleeping bag on the cot, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As night fell, the storm intensified. The wind screamed around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the trees outside creak and groan under the assault. Sleep was just starting to take me when I heard it, a sound that cut through the howling wind and made my blood run cold, scratching, coming from the walls outside. My eyes snapped open, body tensing. It had to be a tree branch, right? Just the wind playing tricks on me. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. It moved along the wall, circling the cabin. Whatever was making that sound was big. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. The scratching stopped directly outside the window. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a thud against the glass, so sudden and loud, I nearly fell off the cot. Heart hammering, I fumbled for my headlamp. The beam illuminated frost patterns on the window, but beyond that was only swirling snow and darkness. Another thud, harder this time. The whole cabin seemed to shake with the impact. "Hello!" I called out, hating how weak and frightened my voice sounded. "Is someone out there?" The only answer was another bone-jarring thud against the window. This time, I saw it, a massive, dark shape moving just beyond the glass. It wasn't human. The shape shifted, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Eyes that were far too intelligent, far too aware. I scrambled back, nearly falling off the cot in my haste to get away from the window. This couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming. A low growl vibrated through the cabin, a sound so deep I felt it in my chest. It was hungry, that growl, hungry and angry. The scratching resumed, more frantic now. It moved from the window to the door, long claws raking down the wood. The whole cabin shuddered under the assault. I pressed myself into the farthest corner, eyes darting wildly around the room. There had to be a weapon, something I could use to defend myself, but the cabin was bare, save for the stove and table. The door groaned under the strain, wood splintering. It wouldn't hold much longer. In desperation, I lunged for the stove. The fire had burned down to embers, but the metal was still hot. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I wrenched one of the iron legs free. Not much of a weapon, but it was all I had. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the howling of the wind. Then a new noise, snuffling, like some great beast scenting the air. It was trying to smell me. I raised the stove leg, muscles trembling with fear and adrenaline. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, you bastard!" The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and snow. A blast of frigid air rushed in, extinguishing what was left of the fire and plunging the cabin into darkness. Something massive filled the doorway, a shape of matted fur and hulking muscle. As it ducked to enter the cabin, I caught another glimpse of those terrible yellow eyes. I swung the stove leg with all my might, connecting with a satisfying thud. The creature roared, a sound of pain and rage that shook dust from the rafters. But it didn't go down. A huge, clawed hand shot out, faster than I could react. White-hot pain lanced through my side as those claws raked across my ribs. I stumbled back, warmth spreading across my shirt. My free hand came away red when I touched it. The creature advanced, filling the small cabin with its bulk. This close, I could smell its hot, rancid breath. Those yellow eyes bored into me, full of hunger and alien intelligence. This was it. I was going to die here, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist, just as the creature tensed to spring. A new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades. The monster's head snapped up, a startled growl rumbling from its chest. It glanced back at the open door, then at me, as if weighing its options. The helicopter sound grew louder. Flashlight beams cut through the snowy night, voices calling out. With a final, furious roar, the creature turned and bounded out of the cabin. In seconds, it had vanished into the swirling snow. I sagged to the floor, clutching my bleeding side. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as shock set in. The next few hours passed in a blur. Search and rescue found me, alerted by my emergency beacon when I hadn't checked in. They evacuated me off the mountain, rushing me to the nearest hospital. When I tried to tell them what had happened, they exchanged worried glances. Hypothermia, they said. Hallucinations brought on by exposure and blood loss. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head. But in my dreams, I still hear that unearthly growl. I still see those glowing yellow eyes, full of hunger and otherworldly intelligence. And I know that something is out there in the wilderness, something beyond our understanding. So take it from me. Be careful in the backcountry. Respect the mountains. And if you're caught in a storm and find an old cabin for shelter, take a good long look at the walls. You might not like what you find. Story 7. I've always thought fear had a sound. That night on the mountain face, I learned it also has a smell. Musky, wild, and terrifyingly close. My name's Allison, and I've been a climber for most of my life. From local crags to Yosemite big walls, I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the north face of Mount Terror. Yeah, I know. Mount Terror should have been our first clue, right? My climbing partner Jess and I had been planning this ascent for months. It was a challenging route, a 3,000-foot wall of near-vertical granite, rarely climbed due to its remote location in the North Cascades. We were attempting it alpine style, carrying minimal gear and planning to bivouac on the wall. The first day went smoothly. We made good time, the rock solid and the weather holding. As the sun began to set, we reached a small ledge, barely big enough for our portaledge, but it would do for the night. We set up our hanging tent with practiced efficiency, securing it to the wall with a complex web of ropes and carabiners. By the time we crawled inside, the last light was fading from the sky. Not a bad spot for a bedroom, Jess grinned, passing me a bag of freeze-dried pasta. I laughed, taking in the view. Miles of wilderness stretched out below us, dark forests and snow-capped peaks fading into the twilight. It was breathtaking. Better than any 5-star hotel, I agreed. We ate, making plans for the next day's climb. The crux pitch was coming up, a blank face with minimal protection. It would be challenging, but we were ready for it, or so we thought. The trouble started around midnight. I woke to the portalage swaying gently, which wasn't unusual. Wind often buffeted us on big wall climbs, but this felt different, more deliberate. I lay still, listening. The night was quiet, no wind to speak of, yet the ledge continued to move, almost like something was pushing it. "Jess," I whispered, reaching out to shake her shoulder. "You feel that?" She stirred, raising her head. "Feel what?" Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled through the night air. It wasn't the growl of any animal I'd ever heard, deeper, almost subsonic. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. Jess bolted upright, her eyes wide in the dim light of our headlamps. "What the hell was that?" The portalage shook violently, nearly pitching us out. We grabbed for the sides, hearts pounding. "Something's out there!" I hissed, fumbling for the zipper of our tent. "Ali, wait!" But I was already unzipping the door, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vast emptiness of the night, stars twinkling coldly overhead. Then something moved. A massive shape shifted just beyond the edge of our ledge. In the weak beam of my headlamp, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of muscles rippling beneath a shaggy coat. "Holy shit," I breathed, scrambling back. The shape moved closer, and suddenly I was staring into a pair of eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the darkness. They were huge, set in a face that was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape features. But there was an intelligence in those eyes that chilled me to my core. This was no ordinary animal. A massive, clawed hand reached for the edge of our portal edge. I could see the wickedly curved talons, each easily as long as my finger. "Jess," I said, my voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "When I say go, cut the rear anchor." She nodded, face pale but determined as she reached for her knife. The creature leaned in closer, its hot, rancid breath filling our small tent. I could see rows of yellowed fangs as its mouth opened in a silent snarl. "Go!" I yelled. Jess slashed through the rear anchor line. The portal edge tilted crazily, dumping us against the rock face. The creature roared, a sound so loud and inhuman it made my ears ring as it lost its grip and tumbled away into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. Moving with the frantic speed born of terror, we cut away the rest of the portalage and started climbing. Forget the planned route, forget proper safety procedures. We climbed through the night, placing minimal protection, focused only on getting as high and as far away as possible. Dawn found us huddled on a narrow ledge, several hundred feet higher, exhausted and shell-shocked. In the growing light, I examined the deep claw marks gouged into my harness, silent testimony that the night's events hadn't been some shared hallucination. "What do we do now?" Jess asked, her voice hoarse. I looked up at the remaining 1,000 feet of rock above us, then down at the dizzying drop we'd climbed through the night. "We keep going up," I said. "We're closer to the summit than the base, and I sure as hell don't want to rappel back down there." Jess nodded grimly. We took a few minutes to eat and drink, then started climbing again. The day passed in a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every shadow seemed to hide yellow eyes. Every gust of wind carried phantom growls. We climbed faster than we ever had before, fueled by the primal need to get off this godforsaken mountain. As the sun began to set, we finally pulled ourselves over the summit ridge. I've never been so glad to see flat ground in my life. We didn't stop to celebrate or admire the view. There was a hiking trail on the other side of the mountain, leading down to a ranger station. We practically ran down it, headlamps bobbing in the gathering gloom. It was fully dark by the time we stumbled into the station, babbling about monsters and glowing eyes. The rangers looked at us like we were insane, but they were kind enough to let us stay the night. In the morning, a search and rescue team went up to retrieve our abandoned gear. They came back empty-handed, saying they'd found no sign of our bivouac site or any unusual tracks. The official report cited equipment failure and sleep deprivation as the cause of our shared delusion. Jess and I knew better. But we stopped trying to convince people. Who would believe us anyway? I still climb, but never again in that part of the Cascades. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that unearthly growl. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find any similar encounters. Bigfoot sightings, Wendigo legends, cryptid reports, I've read them all. Nothing quite matches what we saw that night. But there are enough similarities to make me believe we're not alone in our experience. There's a whole world out there we don't understand, hidden in the wild places where humans rarely venture, things that lurk in the shadows, watching and waiting. So let me give you some advice, from one climber to another. When you're out there on the wall, suspended between earth and sky, pay attention to more than just your next hold. Listen to the night sounds, trust your instincts. And if you wake up to your portalage shaking, with no wind to blame it on, don't look outside, don't unzip that tent, just start climbing, and don't stop until you reach the top. Because sometimes the monsters aren't just in our imaginations. Sometimes they're real, with claws and fangs and hungry, glowing eyes, and they're closer than you think. Story 8. The stench hit me first, a nauseating mix of decay and something else, something alien and wrong. Then came the eyes, glowing in the darkness like twin embers from hell. I'm Rick, a forest ranger with 15 years under my belt. I thought I'd seen it all, from lost hikers to aggressive wildlife, but nothing in my training prepared me for what I found in that abandoned mine shaft. It started with reports of a foul odor near one of the old copper mines that dotted the mountains in my jurisdiction. Normally, I'd write it off as rotting vegetation or maybe a dead animal, but the reports kept coming, each more insistent than the last. Smells like death, one hiker told me, his face pale. Ain't natural, I'm telling you. After the 5th complaint in as many days, I knew I had to check it out myself. I geared up early one morning, packing extra batteries for my flashlight and a bandana to cover my nose if the smell was as bad as they said. The hike to the mine was uneventful, the early autumn air crisp and invigorating, but as I neared the location, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The forest had gone quiet, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie, oppressive silence. Then the smell hit me, so strong it made my eyes water. I pulled the bandana over my nose, but it did little to block the stench. Taking a deep breath through my mouth, I approached the mine entrance. The opening was larger than I expected, the old timber supports sagging but still intact. Faded warning signs hung askew, their messages of danger barely legible after years of exposure. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The smell was definitely coming from inside. Steeling myself, I ducked under a fallen beam and entered the mine. The temperature dropped immediately, the cool mountain air replaced by a damp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. My flashlight illuminated rough-hewn walls, the rock glittering faintly with traces of copper ore. I moved deeper into the tunnel, my footsteps echoing eerily. The smell grew stronger with each step, becoming almost unbearable. I was about to turn back when my light fell on something that made me freeze. Bones, piles of them, scattered across the tunnel floor. I crouched down, examining them closer. Most appeared to be animal bones, deer, maybe some elk, but mixed in were others I couldn't identify, their shapes strange and unnatural. And there, half hidden under a pile of mouldering leaves, was something that made my blood run cold. A human skull, yellowed with age, but unmistakable. I stood quickly, my heart pounding. This was way above my pay grade. I needed to get out, call in reinforcements, maybe even the FBI. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from deeper in the mine. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. A flicker of pale, emaciated limbs disappearing around a corner. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice echoed down the tunnel, seeming to multiply until it sounded like a chorus of spectral voices. Silence answered me, But as I strained my ears, I could hear something breathing, slow and raspy, like someone or something trying to remain quiet. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was a ranger, damn it. If there was someone down here, injured or lost, it was my job to help them. "This is Ranger Rick Hawkins," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here to help. Can you come out where I can see you?" More silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, a voice. "Hungry!" The word was barely human, more of a guttural growl than speech. It raised the hair on the back of my neck. I have some food in my pack," I said, slowly reaching for my backpack. "Why don't you come out and we can—" A shriek cut me off, high-pitched and feral. It echoed through the mine like the wail of a banshee. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. And then I saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing and sickly yellow-green in the darkness. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal cave-dwelling animal. As my light swept across them, I caught glimpses of pale, almost translucent skin, elongated limbs, faces that were almost human, but wrong, noseless, with mouths too wide and filled with needle-sharp teeth. "Jesus Christ!" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. One of the creatures stepped forward into the full beam of my flashlight. I wished to God it hadn't. It was humanoid, but only in the loosest sense of the word. Taller than me by at least a foot, with limbs so thin they looked like they should snap under its own weight. Its skin was a pallid grey, stretched tight over visible bones. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Sunken cheeks, those glowing eyes, and a mouth that split its face nearly in half, filled with row upon row of jagged teeth. It cocked its head, studying me with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless aggression. Then it spoke again, in that same growling approximation of speech. "Food!" I ran. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I fought, or at least tried to reason with the thing. But in that moment, faced with something that shattered my entire understanding of reality, my body acted on pure instinct. I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their movements almost silent save for the occasional scrape of claw on stone. My lungs burned as I ran, the stench of the mine making each breath a struggle. I could see light ahead, the entrance so close yet impossibly far. Something swiped at my back, claws raking across my jacket. I felt the fabric tear, but adrenaline kept me from feeling any pain. I put on an extra burst of speed, diving for the mine entrance. I hit the ground hard, tumbling out into the blessed sunlight. I scrambled to my feet, ready to keep running, but the creatures didn't follow. They hovered just inside the mine entrance, hissing and shrieking, but unwilling or unable to step into the light. As I watched, they retreated back into the darkness, those glowing eyes the last thing to disappear. I didn't stop shaking for hours. When I finally gathered myself enough to call it in, I barely knew what to say. How do you report something like that? In the end, I told my superiors about the bones, including the human remains. I mentioned a hostile, unidentified animal presence in the mine, but left out the details. Who would believe me anyway? A team was sent to investigate. They found the bones, just as I'd reported, but of the creatures there was no sign. The deeper tunnels had collapsed, they said. Must have been unstable. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. No cave-in could explain that away. I still work as a ranger, but I requested a transfer to a different district. Somewhere with fewer mines, fewer dark places for things to hide. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear them, those rasping voices, those inhuman shrieks, and I wonder how many other dark places are out there, hiding things we were never meant to see. How thin is the line between our world and theirs. So let me give you some advice. If you're out hiking and come across an old mine or cave, just leave it be. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because some things are better left in the dark, and if you smell something foul on the wind, something that makes your instincts scream danger, run, run, and don't look back, because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're hungry. Story 9. The first pair of eyes that reflected our flashlight beams wasn't so bad. It was the dozens that followed, and the sounds of shuffling bodies emerging from the darkness that turned our hunting trip into a nightmare. My name's Mike, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. My buddy Dave and I had been tracking a nice buck for the better part of the day. We were deep in the backcountry, further than we'd ever ventured before, but the promise of a trophy rack kept us pushing forward. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains when we finally caught up to our quarry. Dave lined up the shot, his breath steady as he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees, and the buck dropped. "Nice shot!" I clapped Dave on the back as we jogged over to our prize, but as we approached, my excitement turned to confusion. The buck lay on its side, but something was wrong. Its belly had been torn open, steam rising from the wound in the cold mountain air. "What the hell?" Dave muttered, crouching down to examine the carcass. The injury wasn't from our bullet. The edges were ragged, flesh stripped away in long, vicious tears. This was the work of claws and teeth, not lead. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "We should go," I said, scanning the surrounding trees. "Under whatever did this might still be around." Dave nodded, his earlier bravado replaced by wary caution. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We turned to head back the way we came, but in the fading light, nothing looked familiar. The trees all blended together, shadows deepening between their trunks. "Shit," Dave cursed, fumbling for his compass. "I think we got turned around." I pulled out my flashlight as darkness fell in earnest. Its beam seemed feeble against the encroaching night. "Let's try to find some high ground," I suggested. "Maybe we can spot a landmark." We pushed on through the underbrush, the silence of the forest pressing in around us. No owls hooted, no small animals rustled in the leaves. It was as if all other life had fled the area. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, the trees began to thin. We emerged into a small clearing and found ourselves facing the mouth of a cave. "Hold up," I said, grabbing Dave's arm. "You smell that?" A foul odor wafted from the cave entrance, the unmistakable stench of decay and old blood. Mixed with it was something else, a musky animal smell I couldn't quite place. Dave wrinkled his nose. "Jesus, that's rank. What do you think? Bear den?" I shook my head slowly. I've smelled bear dens before. This is different. As if in response to my words, a low growl emanated from the darkness of the cave. We froze, flashlight beams fixed on the entrance. "Okay, time to go," Dave whispered, taking a step back. That's when we saw the first pair of eyes reflecting our lights, yellow-green and unblinking, set too high off the ground to belong to any normal predator. My mouth went dry. "Dave," I said, my voice barely audible. "Run!" But before we could move, more eyes appeared. 2 pairs, then 4, then too many to count. They filled the cave entrance, and with them came sounds, shuffling footsteps, low growls, the click of claws on stone. We stood rooted to the spot as the first creature emerged into the moonlight. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with a build that reminded me of the illustrations of early hominids I'd seen in textbooks. But this was no missing link in human evolution. Its body was covered in patchy fur, matted and caked with what looked horribly like dried blood. Long arms ended in hands tipped with wicked claws, but it was the face that stopped my heart. A twisted blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout filled with yellowed fangs. More creatures followed, pouring out of the cave entrance like a nightmare made flesh. Some moved on all 4s, others stood upright. All had those same glowing eyes fixed on us with predatory intent. "Oh, God," Dave whimpered beside me. "Oh, God, oh, God." The lead creature tilted its head, studying us with unsettling intelligence. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound that was part roar, part howl, a noise no human throat could produce. The spell of terror that had held us in place shattered. We ran. Crashing through the underbrush, hearts pounding, we fled deeper into the forest. Behind us, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their movements almost silent save for the occasional snap of a branch. "The river!" Dave gasped as we ran. "If we can reach the river, maybe we can—" His words cut off in a strangled cry as something hit him from behind. I skidded to a stop, turning to see Dave on the ground, one of the creatures on top of him. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. The shot went wide, but the noise was enough to startle the beast. It leapt off Dave with inhuman agility, melting back into the shadows. I hauled Dave to his feet. He was pale, shaking, but seemed uninjured. "Thanks," he panted. "Don't thank me yet," I replied grimly. The woods around us were alive with movement, glowing eyes flickering between the trees. "We're surrounded." We stood back to back, rifles raised. I tried to control my breathing, to steady my aim, but it was useless. There were too many of them. A twig snapped to my left. I whirled, finger tightening on the trigger, and found myself face to face with the lead creature. This close, I could smell its hot, rancid breath. Those glowing eyes bored into mine, filled with a terrible hunger. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. I waited for it to strike, to tear me apart with those wicked claws, but it didn't move. Instead, it spoke. The sound was guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but I understood the word well enough. "Leave." I blinked, certain I had misheard, but the creature's meaning became clear as it took a step back, then another. The other beasts followed suit, retreating into the shadows, but never taking their eyes off us. They were letting us go. I didn't question our luck. Grabbing Dave's arm, I started backing away slowly. "Easy," I murmured, "nice and slow." We retreated step by agonizing step, expecting at any moment for the creatures to change their minds and charge, but they simply watched, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. As we reached the edge of a small rise, I risked a glance over my shoulder. In the distance, I could see the silver ribbon of the river cutting through the valley. "Okay," I whispered to Dave. "On 3, we run for the river. 1, 2, 3. We turned and sprinted down the slope. Behind us, a chorus of howls split the night, not pursuing, but almost mournful. A farewell, or perhaps a warning. We didn't stop running until we hit the icy water of the river. We waded across, the cold shocking us back to our senses. Only when we reached the far bank did we allow ourselves to look back. The forest on the other side was still and silent. No glowing eyes, no shadowy figures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We made it back to civilization eventually, stumbling into a ranger station just as dawn was breaking. We told them we'd gotten lost, left out the parts about monsters in the woods. Who would have believed us anyway? I still hunt, but never in that part of the forest. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear those howls in the distance, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. So let me give you some advice. If you're out in the wild and come across a kill that doesn't look right, or smell something that makes your instincts scream danger, don't investigate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Just leave, and don't look back. Because sometimes we're not the top of the food chain. And the things that are, they're hungry, and they're watching. Story 10. The first whisper could have been the wind. The second made us uneasy. By the third, we knew we weren't alone in these woods, and whatever was out there wasn't human. I'm Jess, and I've been camping since I was a kid. My friends, Mike, Sarah, and Danny, were relatively new to the outdoors, so I'd planned this trip as an easy introduction to backcountry camping. A 2-night stay in a secluded spot I'd found years ago, far from the usual tourist trails but still close enough to civilization for comfort, or so I thought. We hit the trail early Saturday morning, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The hike was beautiful, leaves just starting to turn gold and red. I pointed out edible berries and interesting fungi as we walked, feeling a bit like a nature guide. "You sure you know where we're going?" Mike asked as the trail grew fainter, nearly disappearing in places. I grinned over my shoulder. "Trust me, city boy. I've got this." But as the day wore on, a nagging doubt crept in. The landscape didn't look quite as I remembered it. The creek I'd been using as a landmark was running lower than it should have been, changing the shape of the valley. I didn't let on to the others, not wanting to worry them. We'd find the spot eventually, and if not, any clearing would do for camping. The sun was dipping low when we finally found a suitable site. It wasn't the idyllic spot I'd promised, but it was flat and near water. Good enough. "Home sweet home," I announced, dropping my pack with relief. We set up camp efficiently. Tents clustered around a fire pit I built from stones. As darkness fell, we huddled around the crackling flames, roasting marshmallows and trading stories. "Okay, my turn for a scary story," Mike said, his face eerily lit by the firelight. "Then this really happened to my cousin's friend." I tuned out, having heard plenty of friend of a friend campfire tales before. Instead, I found myself listening to the forest around us. The usual nighttime sounds were there, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but underneath it all was something else, a faint whispering. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind in the leaves. But the sound persisted, just at the edge of hearing, words almost forming, then fading away. "Jess? Hello? Earth to Jess?" I startled, realizing Sarah had been trying to get my attention. "Sorry." "What?" I said. "Do you hear something weird?" My blood ran cold. "You hear it too." The others fell silent, straining to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing but the pop and crackle of our fire. Then we all heard it. Clear as day, a whispered voice from the darkness beyond our campsite. "They're here." We froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "Okay." "Very funny," Danny said, her voice shaky. "Who's messing with us?" But I could see in their faces that they all knew the truth. None of us had spoken. "It's probably just other campers," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe they're lost and saw our fire." Mike stood up, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone out there?" Silence answered him. Then from a different direction, another whisper. "Fresh meat." Sarah let out a small scream, clapping her hand over her mouth. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," I said, standing up. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Whoever's out there, show yourself." More whispers answered, coming from all around us now. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, hungry, eager, inhuman. "We need to go," Danny said, her face pale in the firelight. "Now!" I wanted to argue, to say we were safer by the fire, but deep down I knew she was right. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. "Pack up, quickly," I ordered. "Grab only what you need. We're getting out of here." We moved with frantic energy, shoving sleeping bags into packs and collapsing tents. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I caught fragments of words, taste and flesh, and other things that made my skin crawl. Just as we were shouldering our packs, ready to flee, Mike let out a strangled gasp. "The trees!" I followed his gaze and felt my heart stop. Carved into the trunk of every tree surrounding our campsite were strange symbols, glowing faintly in the firelight. How had we not noticed them before? "Oh God," Sarah whimpered. "What is this?" I shook my head, fighting down panic. "It doesn't matter. We're leaving. Now." We plunged into the darkness, headlamps bobbing as we crashed through the underbrush. I took the lead, trying to retrace our steps from earlier. But nothing looked familiar in the darkness. The whispers followed us, always just out of sight. Sometimes they seemed to come from right beside us, other times from far away. The words grew clearer, more chilling. "Can't escape. Ours now. Forever." We ran for what felt like hours, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. The rational part of my brain knew we were only getting more lost, but blind terror kept us moving. Finally, gasping for breath, we burst into a small clearing. I held up a hand, signaling a stop. "Wait," I panted. "We need to think." The others collapsed to the ground, chests heaving. For a moment, all was quiet, save for our ragged breathing. Then Sarah's voice, small and frightened. "Guys, where's Mike?" Ice flooded my veins as I realized she was right. There were only 3 of us in the clearing. "He was right behind me," Danny said, her voice rising in panic. "I swear, he was right there." A scream split the night, distant, but unmistakably Mike's. It cut off abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than any whisper. Sarah started to sob. Danny looked like she was about to be sick. And me. I felt a calm settle over me, the strange clarity that comes with absolute terror. "Listen to me," I said, my voice low and urgent. "We can't panic. We stick together no matter what. Okay?" They nodded, eyes wide and frightened in the dim light of our headlamps. "Okay, now we need to—" I never finished that sentence, because at that moment, every tree around the clearing lit up with those strange, glowing symbols. And stepping out from behind them came things. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin seemed to shift and ripple in the faint light. But it was their faces that haunted me, or rather the lack of them. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. And yet, somehow, they spoke. "Welcome," came the whisper, not from any mouth, but seeming to emanate from the creatures themselves. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah screamed. Danny turned and ran. I stood frozen, unable to move as the things glided closer. What happened next is a blur. I remember running, branches tearing at my clothes. I remember Sarah's hand slipping from mine as something dragged her into the darkness. I remember Danny's final, terrified shriek. And I remember the moment I realized I was alone, surrounded by those glowing symbols and the whispers that never stopped. They found me 3 days later, a search and rescue team responding to reports of missing hikers. I was babbling about whispers and faceless monsters, covered in scratches and half-starved. They told me later that there was no sign of my friends, no strange symbols carved in trees, just miles of empty forest. I don't go camping anymore, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear those whispers. And I wonder, are they out there, waiting? Or are they in here, in my head, never truly gone? So let me give you some advice. If you're out in the woods and hear something that might be the wind, might be a whisper, don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Run, and don't look back, because sometimes the monsters are real. And they're always hungry. Story 11. I've spent my life studying wildlife, but nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I captured on that trail camera. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some creatures should remain undiscovered. My name is Dr. Elena Reyes, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large predator behavior. I've tracked wolves in Yellowstone, studied jaguars in the Amazon, and even had a few close calls with grizzlies in Alaska. But it was in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, practically in my own backyard, where I encountered something that defied explanation. It started as a routine study. There had been reports of unusual predator activity in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains, livestock killings that didn't fit the typical pattern for wolves or cougars. The locals were spooked, talking about monsters and cryptids. I, of course, knew better. Nature can be strange, but it always follows rules, or so I thought. I set up a series of trail cameras in the area, hoping to capture images of whatever was responsible for the killings. Standard procedure, nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. The first week's footage was unremarkable. Deer, elk, the occasional black bear, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I was reviewing the images from the second week, something caught my eye. It was just a blur at first, a dark shape at the edge of the frame. Probably a bear, I thought, or maybe a large cat. But there was something off about the proportions, the way it moved. I leaned closer to my computer screen. squinting at the pixelated image. That's when I saw the eyes, two pinpricks of reflected light, set too high off the ground for any normal animal. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever this was, it was bipedal. I quickly flipped through the rest of the images. The shape appeared again and again, always at the edge of the frame, always slightly out of focus. But with each appearance, it seemed to be getting closer to the camera. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of hoax. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The final image from that camera made my blood run cold. The creature, and I knew now it was a creature, not any animal I'd ever encountered, was fully in frame. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with a build that reminded me of the illustrations of early hominids I'd studied in school. But this was no missing link in human evolution. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as the shadows it emerged from. Long arms ended in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that stopped my heart. A twisted blend of ape-like and canine features, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the camera's flash. Those eyes, they weren't the uncomprehending stare of an animal caught in a snapshot. There was intelligence there, and something else. Curiosity, maybe, or hunger. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The image was too clear, too detailed to be a costume. And those eyes, no mask could capture that look. I should have reported it immediately, called in other researchers, alerted the authorities. But something held me back. Professional skepticism, maybe, or perhaps a deeper, more primal instinct warning me not to draw attention to what I'd seen. Instead, I decided to investigate further on my own. I packed my gear and headed out to the site where I'd placed the camera. It was a foolish decision, born of scientific curiosity and, I can admit now, a touch of arrogance. I thought I could handle whatever I found. I was wrong. The hike to the camera site was tense, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. As I neared the location, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in on me from all sides. The camera was where I'd left it, secured to a sturdy pine. But as I approached, I noticed something odd. The tree trunk was marked with deep gouges, claw marks that ran far higher than any bear could reach. My hands shook as I removed the memory card from the camera. Part of me didn't want to see what it had captured, but I had to know. I pulled out my laptop, my back pressed against a tree as I inserted the card. The first few images were normal, more deer, a couple of coyotes. Then, on the third night, it appeared. The creature emerged from the shadows exactly as it had before. But this time, it didn't stay at the edge of the frame. It approached the camera slowly, purposefully. In the final image, its face filled the entire screen, those glowing eyes staring directly into the lens, that twisted mouth open in what could almost be a grin. It knew it was being watched, and now it was watching back. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the small clearing, stood the creature. In person, it was even more terrifying than in the photos. It was huge, its powerful frame dwarfing mine. Those eyes locked onto me with an intelligence that was undeniably sentient. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive, clawed hand. It pointed at my laptop, then at itself. The message was clear. It wanted the images. Moving as if in a dream, I closed the laptop and held it out. The creature took 2 long strides forward, closing the distance between us in an instant. This close, I could smell its musky, animal odor mixed with something else, something metallic and wrong. It plucked the laptop from my hands with surprising gentleness, its claws barely grazing my skin. Then it turned and melted back into the forest, moving with a grace that belied its size. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to process what had just happened. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my lungs burning and legs shaking. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, an overactive imagination, anything to explain away what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew the truth. I kept quiet about my encounter. Who would believe me anyway? I'd seen the ridicule faced by those who claimed to have seen Bigfoot or other cryptids. My career would be over if I came forward with this. But I couldn't let it go entirely. I discreetly reached out to colleagues, asking if they'd heard of any unusual sightings in the area. I pored over local legends and folklore, searching for any mention of creatures that matched what I'd seen. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself staring out into the shadows, wondering, is it out there, watching? Does it remember me as I remember it? I still work as a wildlife biologist, but I've shifted my focus to less remote areas. I tell myself it's for practical reasons, but the truth is, I'm afraid of what I might find if I venture too deep into the wilderness again. So let me give you some advice, from someone who's seen behind the veil of what we think we know about the natural world. If you're out in the wild and you see something that doesn't quite fit, something that sends a chill down your spine even if you can't say why, trust that feeling. Don't investigate. Don't try to prove anything. Just leave, quickly and quietly, because there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that have remained hidden for good reason. And once you've seen them, truly seen them, you can never go back to the comfortable ignorance of before. They're watching us, and now we know they're there. Story 12. The wind howled through the dark pines, a sound so hollow and lonely it seemed to carry every secret of the forest with it. I was on my usual night patrol, the kind of shift that had once been dull, almost monotonous. That was before things started happening, unexplained things. People go missing all the time in national parks. Most times, it's an accident, a wrong turn, bad weather. But lately, there'd been rumors, whispers of something darker, something out there, stalking these woods. I flicked on my flashlight and pointed it toward the path ahead. My boots crunched against the snow as I trudged through the ever-thickening drifts. It had been snowing for hours now, thick flakes falling relentlessly. The trees creaked under the weight of it, bending slightly in the wind. The cold bit into me, gnawing at my exposed skin. The trail was supposed to loop back to the ranger station, but something felt wrong. I hadn't seen any of the familiar markers in over an hour. I glanced at my map but found no answers there, just wilderness for miles in every direction. I let out a breath, watching the cloud of condensation hang in the air for a moment before disappearing into the night. Keep calm, I told myself. You know these woods. You've walked this path 100 times, but even as I tried to reassure myself, I felt it, a creeping sense of unease crawling up my spine. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, footprints, large, impossibly large, embedded in the snow just off the trail. My heart skipped a beat. I knelt down, shining my light on the tracks. They were fresh, not more than a few minutes old, and they were huge. Each print was twice the size of my boot, and the depth suggested a creature much heavier than any bear I'd ever seen. But that wasn't what bothered me the most. No, what really unsettled me was the shape. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't any kind of animal I recognized. They were human, but not quite. I stood up, scanning the tree line. The wind whistled through the branches, and I could hear the faint sound of something moving in the distance, slow, deliberate steps, crunching through the snow. My hand instinctively went to the radio on my belt. I brought it up to my mouth. "Base, this is Ranger Carson. Come in." Static. I tried again, a little more urgency in my voice. "Base, this is Carson. Do you copy?" More static. Nothing. I cursed under my breath. The storm must have knocked out the signal, or maybe I was too deep into the woods. Either way, I was on my own. I wasn't the kind of guy to believe in tall tales. I'd heard my fair share of stories from other rangers, stories of strange creatures, of things that weren't supposed to exist, but I'd always chalked them up to overactive imaginations, too much time alone in the wilderness. Now, though, standing in the middle of a dark, snowy forest, I wasn't so sure. I made the decision to follow the tracks, keeping my light trained on the ground as I moved cautiously forward. The prints led away from the trail, deeper into the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the whole world was holding its breath. After about 10 minutes, I heard it again, the sound of something moving in the distance, closer this time. I stopped, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and methodical, like whatever it was didn't care about being heard. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, sweeping it across the trees. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, moving between the trees, tall, hunched over, and far too big to be human. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to make out more details. It moved into the beam of my light for only a split second, but that was enough. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the light back at me. They were a deep, fiery orange, like embers in a dying fire. And its face, God, its face, was something out of a nightmare. It had the features of a wolf, but elongated, twisted, and distorted. Sharp teeth jutted from its mouth, and its fur was matted and dark, almost blending in with the night. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real, but it was. And it was looking right at me. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then slowly it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as if it had lost interest. My mind raced. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The radio crackled to life suddenly, breaking the silence. I fumbled for it, bringing it to my ear. "Ranger Carson, this is Base. Do you copy?" Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as I was about to respond, the footsteps started again, this time much closer. I didn't need to look to know it was coming back, and this time it wasn't going to just watch me. I ran. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just acted on pure instinct. I tore through the snow, the cold air burning my lungs with every breath. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to get back to the station. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the undergrowth, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. It was closing the distance, fast. I veered off the path, hoping the trees would slow it down, but it was no use. I could feel it gaining on me, hear the heavy, snarling breaths it took with each stride. My legs burned, but I pushed harder, my eyes scanning the dark for any sign of safety. Up ahead, I spotted a rocky outcrop, a place where the trees parted and the land sloped upward. It wasn't much, but it might buy me some time. I scrambled up the rocks, slipping and sliding in the snow. I could hear the creature right behind me now, its growls vibrating through the air, primal and hungry. As I reached the top of the outcrop, I spun around, my back pressed against the cold rock. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, and I shone it down the slope. The creature stood at the base, staring up at me. Its breath came out in ragged bursts, steam rising into the night air. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, it let out a low, guttural growl, baring its teeth. I fumbled for the flare gun strapped to my belt. My hands shook as I loaded it, the creature watching my every move. Finally, I got it ready, raised it, and fired. The flare shot into the sky, bathing the forest in a bright red glow. The creature flinched at the sudden light, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a second I thought it might retreat, but then it did something I didn't expect. It stood up, on two legs. The sheer size of it hit me like a punch to the gut. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was thick with muscle, its fur matted and covered in patches of snow. It looked down at me with a twisted, almost mocking expression. And then it roared. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the trees. I could feel the force of it in my bones. The creature took a step forward, and I knew I had to act. I couldn't outrun it. There was nowhere left to go. With trembling hands, I aimed the flare gun at the creature and fired again, this time directly at it. The flare hit its chest, and for a moment the creature staggered back, swatting at the burning light. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing. By some miracle, I made it back to the station. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed against the wall, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. For hours, I sat there in the dark, waiting for it to come after me, but it never did. When morning came, I stepped outside, half expecting to find the creature waiting for me, but the only thing I saw was a set of massive footprints leading away from the station, disappearing into the forest. I never patrolled that trail again. Story 13. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that crept under my skin. As I stood on the porch of the cabin, looking out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the forest seemed quieter than it should be, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. "Come on, stop being paranoid," Sarah said from inside, her voice muffled by the walls of the cabin. She had already kicked back on the couch with a glass of wine, the fire crackling behind her, filling the room with warmth and light. "This is what we came for, right? Peace and quiet." I forced a smile, trying to brush off the unease gnawing at me. She was right. We'd rented the cabin to get away from the city, to disconnect for a while. No phones, no internet, just the two of us and miles of wilderness. That's what we wanted. But now, standing out here with the forest pressing in, the idea of being so isolated felt more like a threat than a comfort. I took a deep breath of the cold night air and stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. The warmth of the fire hit me instantly, chasing away the bite of the outdoors. Sarah had already put on some music, something soft and ambient, perfect for the cozy evening we'd planned. The tension in my shoulders eased a little, and I sank down beside her on the couch, trying to focus on the moment. "You're tense," she said, her eyes softening as she leaned against me. "This is supposed to be a relaxing weekend, remember?" I know, I replied, forcing a chuckle. "I guess I'm just not used to it being this quiet." "Exactly," she grinned, giving me a playful nudge. "That's the whole point." I nodded, trying to let myself relax, but that sense of something wrong still lingered. It was subtle, like an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. The fire crackled, and the wine in my hand tasted bitter, even though it was supposed to be sweet. The music, once soothing, now seemed too loud, as if it was covering up something else, something I couldn't quite hear. The scratching started just as I was beginning to settle in. At first, it was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft, slow scraping against the door, like something, or someone, was outside, testing the wood with their nails. Sarah must have heard it too, because she sat up, her smile fading. We exchanged a glance, and I saw the same unease in her eyes that had been gnawing at me all night. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, already getting up from the couch, my heart starting to pound. I grabbed the flashlight we'd brought, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The scratching had stopped now, but the air in the cabin felt heavier, like something was pressing down on it. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah stayed behind, her eyes wide as she clutched her glass of wine, like it might somehow protect her. I approached the door slowly, every step deliberate. The flashlight felt awkward in my hand, and I fumbled with it as I unlocked the door. I hesitated for a moment before swinging it open, half expecting to find some stray animal scratching around, but there was nothing, just the empty porch, the dark trees looming beyond, and the wind swirling through the branches. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing everything in a soft white glow, but the peacefulness of the scene did little to calm my nerves. I shined the flashlight across the ground, searching for any sign of what had made the noise, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. They were huge, far too large to belong to any animal I knew of, and the shape of them, they weren't right. They looked almost human but distorted, elongated with claws at the tips of each toe. The prints led from the trees to the porch, stopping just in front of the door, as if whatever had made them had been standing there, waiting, listening. I swallowed hard and took a step back, closing the door quickly and locking it again. My pulse was racing now, my skin prickling with fear. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "Tracks," I said, my mouth dry. "Something's been here. I don't know what, but the tracks are huge." She stared at me, her face paling. "You think it's a bear or something?" I shook my head, though I didn't really know what to think. Bears didn't leave prints like that. "I don't think so," I said, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "But whatever it was, it's big." Sarah stood up, setting her wine glass on the table. Her calm demeanor from earlier was gone, replaced by the same fear that had settled over me. She moved closer to me, her hand gripping my arm. "We should just stay inside," she said quietly. "Maybe it's gone." I wanted to believe her, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The music, still playing softly in the background, felt like a mockery of the danger just outside. I walked over to the stereo and switched it off, leaving us in silence. That's when the growling started. It was low, barely audible at first, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Sarah stiffened next to me, her eyes widening as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It was coming from right outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin, away from the door. We crouched by the window, peering out into the night, but all we could see were the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. The growling stopped, replaced by a soft, almost human-like breathing. I could hear it, faint but distinct, right outside the walls. Something was out there, and it was close, too close. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to lock every door and window and hope that whatever it was would leave. But a part of me knew better. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going anywhere. I started, but I didn't finish. There was a loud bang from the front of the cabin, the sound of something heavy hitting the door. Sarah gasped, and I clutched her hand tighter. The banging continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was testing the strength of the door. Each thud reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls and filling me with dread. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a fire poker from beside the hearth, and moved toward the front door, my whole body trembling. Sarah was right behind me, her breath quick and shallow. As I reached the door, everything went quiet again. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I hesitated, gripping the poker tightly, unsure of what to do. And then, without warning, the window shattered. Glass flew across the room as a massive hand, clawed and covered in matted fur, reached through the broken window. It groped blindly for a moment before finding purchase on the edge of the window frame. Sarah screamed, and I swung the poker with all the strength I had, hitting the arm as hard as I could. The creature let out a furious snarl and withdrew its arm, but I could hear it outside, pacing, growling, furious. I backed away from the window, pulling Sarah with me. We were trapped. There was no way out except through the front door, and that thing was still out there, waiting. "We have to run," I whispered, though my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Where? Where do we go? Into the woods, I said, though I knew it wasn't much of a plan. But staying here wasn't an option. I unlocked the back door as quietly as I could, praying the creature wouldn't hear us. Sarah and I stepped out into the freezing night, the snow crunching under our feet. We moved quickly, ducking behind the cabin and heading for the trees. I glanced back once, just in time to see the creature stepping out of the shadows. It was huge, taller than a man, with long, twisted limbs and glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with sharp teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. We ran. The cold air burned my lungs, and the snow made every step a struggle, but we didn't stop. The growling grew fainter as we plunged deeper into the forest, but I knew it was still behind us, tracking us, waiting for its moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It was small and run down, but the door was intact, and it offered the only shelter we had. We rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind us and locking it. For now, we were safe, but the woods were still out there, and so was the creature. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to stop until it found us. Story 14. The fog was thick tonight, thicker than I'd ever seen. It clung to the mountainside like a living thing, curling around the trees and swallowing the world whole. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the trail disappearing into a wall of mist. The kind of fog that plays tricks on your eyes, makes shadows move where there shouldn't be any. We'd set up camp just before sundown, high up near the peak, thinking we'd get a clear view of the valley below. It was supposed to be a perfect night. Quiet, peaceful. That's what we'd come for, after all. Just me, Sam, and Jake, 3 guys looking for a weekend away from the noise of life. But now, with the fog rolling in thick as smoke and the silence pressing in, I was starting to regret the whole thing. Man, it's like the mist just keeps getting heavier, Sam muttered, poking at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying into the air. Can't even see the stars. Jake sat across from him, staring out into the fog, his face half lit by the glow of the fire. He hadn't said much since it started rolling in, just kept looking off into the distance like he was expecting something. It's weird, right? He finally said, his voice low. Doesn't feel like normal fog, almost. Feels like it's watching. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, even to me. Come on, man. It's just weather. You've been watching too many horror movies. Jake didn't respond. He just kept staring out into the trees, his eyes narrowed. The fire crackled softly, and the only other sound was the wind, whispering through the branches above. No birds, no insects, nothing, just that eerie, unnatural silence. I shifted on my log, pulling my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake the unease that had settled over us. Sam threw another log onto the fire, and I watched the flames lick up around it, casting flickering shadows across the campsite. You guys want to go for a walk or something? He asked, more to break the tension than anything else. Maybe we can get above the fog, see if there's a better view. Yeah, right, Jake muttered, finally tearing his gaze away from the mist. How about we don't wander around in this creepy-ass fog at night? I'm good right here. I was about to agree with him when a sound cut through the stillness, a distant, low, guttural noise that seemed to come from somewhere out in the fog. We all froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. A growl. Did you guys hear that? Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart starting to pound in my chest. I strained my ears, listening. The sound didn't come again. But that one growl had been enough to put me on edge. The mountains were home to all kinds of wildlife. Sure, but that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. Too deep, too unnatural. Jake stood up, brushing off his jeans. Maybe we should pack up, head back down the trail, at least to a lower elevation. What now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. In the dark. That's how people get lost. We stay here. We'll get more than lost, Jake said, glancing back toward the fog, which seemed even closer now, like it was creeping in around us. You saw the news, right? Couple of hikers went missing up here last month. Never found them. Sam shook his head. Come on, man, it's just fog. We're not going anywhere until morning. But Jake wasn't listening. He had his backpack slung over his shoulder and was already heading toward the edge of the camp, toward where the trail had been, before the fog swallowed it. I stood up, unsure of what to do. Follow Jake into the unknown, or stay here, in the safety of the firelight. Neither option felt particularly safe anymore. Then, out of nowhere, the growl came again, louder this time, closer. A deep, rumbling sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It echoed through the fog, sending a shiver down my spine. "Okay, maybe Jake's right," I said, grabbing my pack. "We should move." Sam stood up too, his face pale in the firelight. "What the hell was that? A bear?" "I don't think so," Jake called over his shoulder, already disappearing into the mist. "Whatever it is, I don't want to stick around to find out." I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and clicked it on, the beam barely cutting through the thick fog. We followed after Jake, leaving the fire behind, our only source of warmth and light, shrinking into the mist. The silence out here was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional gust of wind. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of Jake up ahead, his figure barely visible through the haze. The fog was so dense, I couldn't tell where the trail ended and the wilderness began. We hadn't gone more than 10 minutes when Sam stopped dead in his tracks, grabbing my arm. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, in the fog, was a figure. It was tall, taller than any human, and hunched over, its silhouette barely visible through the swirling mist. For a moment, I thought it might just be a tree or some trick of the light, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. Its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural, and the way it seemed to glide through the fog, as if it was part of it, it made my blood run cold. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaky. "We need to go!" Now, he didn't answer. The only sound was the faint crunching of footsteps ahead, but they were getting quieter, fading into the fog. Panic surged through me. "Jake!" I shouted, louder this time, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the mist. Sam tugged on my arm. "We need to move. We can find Jake later, but we can't stay here." I didn't want to leave him behind, but something deep inside me knew that staying put was a death sentence. Whatever that thing was, it was watching us, waiting. I could feel it. The growling came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. We took off running, stumbling through the fog, the light from my flashlight bouncing wildly as we sprinted. The figure, whatever it was, moved in the periphery of my vision, always just out of reach, always just at the edge of the fog. The growling followed us, that deep, primal sound reverberating through the mountains. And then from somewhere behind us, there was a scream, high-pitched, guttural, and filled with pain. "Jake!" I stopped, my chest heaving, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to help him. But Sam grabbed my arm, his face pale and wild with fear. "We can't go back," he said, breathless. "We can't. Whatever that is, it's hunting us." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that we couldn't just leave Jake behind, but the terror in his eyes was reflected in my own. We weren't dealing with something normal. This was something out of a nightmare. We ran. The fog seemed endless, swallowing up everything in its path. We stumbled over rocks, pushed through branches, our legs burning with every step. The growling never stopped. It was always there, just behind us, a constant reminder that we were being chased. I didn't know how long we ran, minutes, hours. Time didn't seem to exist in that fog, but eventually the growling began to fade. The footsteps behind us grew quieter until, finally, they disappeared altogether. We slowed down, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking from fear and exhaustion. We were deep in the woods now, far from our camp, far from anything familiar. Sam collapsed against a tree, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. What was that thing?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that Jake was gone, and we were alone in the middle of the wilderness, with no idea how to get back. The fog still lingered, but it was thinning now, revealing more of the forest around us, but the sense of danger hadn't left. It was still out there, watching, waiting. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to find our way out of here before it comes back." Sam nodded weakly, pushing himself up from the ground. Together, we stumbled forward, the weight of what had just happened hanging over us like a shadow. The fog might have lifted, but whatever had hunted us in the mist, it wasn't finished. Not yet. Story 15. It started with footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining them, the kind of trick your brain plays on you when you're alone in an old place. But there they were, unmistakable, slow, deliberate, circling below us. We were deep in the national park, exploring an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in decades. The place was a shell of what it once was, creaking with every gust of wind, the floorboards groaning under the weight of time. I stood at the top with Danny, my best friend, the two of us looking out over a sea of pine trees stretching for miles in every direction. It was just us and the endless wilderness, or so I thought. "Do you hear that?" Danny asked, his voice low, tension creeping into his usually carefree tone. I nodded, trying to steady my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. There was someone or something down there, circling the base of the tower. The footsteps were too fast for a human. No hiker or animal would move like that. I peered over the railing, scanning the shadows at the forest's edge, but the fog had started to roll in, swallowing the ground below us. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. "Maybe a deer or a coyote. They move fast." But Danny wasn't buying it. "That's no deer, man. It's too heavy, and whatever it is, it knows we're up here." I glanced at him, and for the first time on this trip, he looked genuinely scared. Danny wasn't the type to get rattled easily. We'd spent years hiking and camping in these woods, chasing the thrill of being out in the middle of nowhere, but this time was different. This time, the thrill had turned into something darker. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Everything went quiet, too quiet. I leaned over the railing again, my flashlight cutting weak beams through the growing fog. Still, nothing. But the silence was suffocating. Not a single bird called, not a breath of wind rustled the leaves. It was as if the entire forest had frozen, holding its breath along with us. "I think it's gone," I said, but even I didn't believe it. Danny took a step back from the edge, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We should get out of here," I laughed nervously. "What? Climb down into that? You've lost it." But the truth was, I felt the same way. Every instinct I had was screaming to leave, to run, but I knew the second we stepped off that tower, we'd be vulnerable, too exposed, too easy to catch. There it was again, footsteps. This time, closer and faster. I gripped the railing, my flashlight beam dancing over the undergrowth, trying to catch even the smallest glimpse of what was stalking us. But whatever it was smart, staying just out of reach, hidden in the mist. My heart was pounding now, my palms slick with sweat despite the cold. "Maybe it's a bear," Danny whispered, his voice shaking. "They can be quiet when they want to be." "This isn't quiet," I whispered back. "This is stalking." Just as I said it, a deep, guttural growl rose up from below. It was low, almost vibrating through the air, the kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear. Danny and I froze, locking eyes for a brief, panicked second. "That's no bear," I muttered. The growling grew louder, more insistent, like whatever was making it was letting us know it was there, and it was coming for us. The footsteps resumed, circling faster, the wood of the tower vibrating with each step. "Okay, we've got to move," Danny said, backing toward the door that led to the stairwell. "We can't stay up here. If it's a predator, it's waiting us out." I knew he was right. Whatever was down there wasn't going to leave, and we couldn't just sit here hoping it would get bored. But climbing down into the fog, knowing something was waiting for us, that felt like walking into the jaws of a trap. Still, We had no choice. "On three," I said, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, even though I knew it wouldn't do me any good. 1, 2, 3. We bolted through the doorway, our boots slamming against the creaky wooden stairs as we started our descent. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, but I barely noticed. My mind focused on the growling that was now directly below us. The fog thickened as we went down, each step blurring into the next as the forest floor disappeared in the swirling mist. Danny was ahead of me, moving fast, too fast. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks, nearly sending me crashing into him. I looked past him and froze. At the base of the stairs, half hidden by the fog, was something massive. It stood on 2 legs, hunched over, its broad shoulders almost brushing the side of the tower. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes, glowing, animalistic eyes, caught the beam of my flashlight, reflecting it back at us with an eerie yellow shine. For a moment, none of us moved. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, its breath steaming in the cold air. I could feel it watching us, measuring us. "What the hell is that?" Danny whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. My mind was blank with fear. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The creature took a step forward, its claws scraping against the wood, the sound sending a jolt of terror through me. "Run!" Danny yelled, breaking the spell. We tore off down the remaining stairs, sprinting into the thick fog, the sounds of the creature's footsteps crashing through the undergrowth right behind us. I didn't dare look back. The only thought in my mind was getting as far from that thing as possible. We hit the ground running, dodging between trees and jumping over fallen logs, the fog wrapping around us like a shroud. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But the footsteps never stopped. Whatever it was keeping pace with us, its growls growing louder, more feral. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and went down hard, my hands slamming into the cold, wet earth. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely registered it. All I could think was, I can't stop. If I stop, I'm dead. Danny grabbed my arm, hauling me to my feet. "Come on, man, get up." We kept running, the fog so thick now I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The footsteps were right behind us, heavy and fast, crashing through the trees like a freight train. I could hear its growls, deep and primal, vibrating through the air, and I knew it was gaining on us. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I realized too late that we had run straight off the edge of a ridge. We tumbled down the slope, rolling and crashing through the underbrush, branches scraping at my skin, the world spinning around me. When I finally hit the bottom, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented. The fog was thinner down here, and through it I could see Danny lying a few feet away, groaning in pain. The footsteps stopped. I lay still, my breath shallow, straining to hear any sound of movement, but there was nothing, just the silence of the forest and the pounding of my heart. Then, out of the fog, I saw it. The creature stood at the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with long, muscular limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I thought it was going to come down after us, finish what it had started, but instead, it turned and disappeared into the fog, its footsteps fading into the distance. I lay there for a long time, too terrified to move, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. Eventually, Danny and I pulled ourselves up, bruised and bloodied, and made our way back to the trail. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Whatever we had seen out there in the fog, it wasn't something I could explain. All I knew was that I wasn't coming back to these woods. Not ever again. Story 16. The first thing I noticed were the lights. Strange, flickering lights that shimmered just beyond the tree line, like faint lanterns swaying in the dark. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but fireflies don't hover in place like that. They don't glow with a steady, unnatural brightness. We were camping in the Appalachian Mountains, a group of 5 college friends out for one last trip before the summer ended. The kind of trip that was supposed to be all about hiking, beers by the campfire, and telling ghost stories under the stars. It was supposed to be fun, but those lights, they weren't part of the plan. I nudged Hannah, who was sitting next to me, poking at the fire with a stick. "You see that?" She looked up, following my gaze, and her face immediately lost some of its color. "Yeah," she said slowly. "What the hell is that?" The others noticed too. Chris, our self-appointed trip leader, squinted into the trees, his brow furrowing. "Probably just someone else camping nearby," he said, trying to sound nonchalant, but his voice wavered. "Nothing to worry about." "Out here?" asked Maria, sitting cross-legged across from me. "We haven't seen anyone for miles, and besides, why would they have lights like that?" She was right. We were deep in the wilderness, far from any trails, and had picked this spot specifically because we didn't want to run into anyone else. But those lights, there was something about them. They were too steady, too deliberate, as if they were watching us, and they weren't getting any closer or farther away, just hovering. "Maybe we should check it out," Paul suggested, always the thrill-seeker. He was the type to turn any moment into an adventure, the kind of guy who loved to poke around places no one else wanted to go. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. It's weird. Let's just stay here." But Chris stood up, brushing off his jeans. "We'll take a look," he said, trying to play the role of brave leader. "We'll be back in 5. If it's nothing, we'll forget about it and get back to the fire." Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. Chris, Paul, and I set off toward the lights, while the girls stayed behind by the fire. Every step we took into the forest felt wrong. The air was cooler here, and the trees seemed to close in tighter the deeper we went. The lights were still there, floating just ahead, and no matter how far we walked, they stayed the same distance away. Paul broke the silence. "Maybe they're those ball lightning things. You know, those electrical orbs or whatever." "I don't think ball lightning hangs out in the same spot like this," I muttered, keeping my voice low, as if speaking too loud might disturb something that didn't want to be disturbed. We walked for what felt like forever, but when I glanced back, the glow from our campfire was barely visible. I stopped in my tracks. "Guys, this is stupid. We should go back." Chris sighed, clearly annoyed. "We've come this far. We'll just get a little closer and—" Before he could finish, the lights flickered and moved, but not toward us. They shifted, fast, darting off into the trees like they had been startled. My heart pounded in my chest. "What the hell?" Paul whispered, taking a step back. Chris, ever the skeptic, kept going. "It's just some weird natural phenomenon. There's got to be an explanation." I wasn't so sure. Something about those lights felt off. They didn't behave like anything I'd ever seen. It was as if they were alive, and as soon as they darted away, the woods around us seemed to change. The air felt heavier, colder. The forest was unnervingly quiet, like every living thing had suddenly vanished. "We're going back," I said, my voice firmer this time. Paul nodded, clearly shaken. Chris hesitated for a second, but even he looked uneasy now. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's head back." We turned around and started making our way back to the camp. But after a few minutes, something felt wrong. The trees didn't look familiar. The path we'd taken wasn't there. The forest seemed different, more dense, and the glow of the campfire was nowhere to be seen. "Where's the fire?" Paul asked, panic creeping into his voice. "We couldn't have gone that far," I said, scanning the woods, trying to find something, anything that looked familiar. But the more I looked, the more I realized we were lost. Chris took out his phone, but the screen was nothing but a blank, glowing rectangle. No signal. "Great. We didn't walk that far," Paul repeated, his breathing quickening. "We didn't. Where the hell are we?" The lights flickered in the distance again, closer this time, almost as if they had circled around behind us. I swallowed hard. We're not alone. The lights, there were more of them now, hovered just beyond the tree line, glowing faintly in the thickening darkness. And then, For the first time, I noticed something else. Shapes. Tall bipedal figures standing in the shadows, barely visible, their forms blending in with the trees. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us. I pointed my flashlight toward them, and the beam flickered as if it was struggling to stay on. For a second I caught a glimpse of one of the figures. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with long, sinewy limbs and a face that looked almost human. But its eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the orbs we had been chasing. I felt my stomach drop. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Paul forward. "Go!" We took off through the woods, crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The lights flickered wildly around us, and I could hear the heavy footsteps of something following, crashing through the trees behind us. Whatever those things were, they were fast. I heard Paul scream, and when I looked back, he was on the ground, one of the figures standing over him, its glowing eyes locked onto his. I skidded to a halt, my heart hammering in my chest. "Paul!" Chris grabbed my arm. "We can't help him! We have to go!" But I couldn't just leave him. I ran back, swinging my flashlight at the creature, desperate to do something, anything, to get it away from him. The beam flickered wildly, barely staying on, but for a brief moment the light hit the creature full on, and it recoiled, hissing like it was in pain. I grabbed Paul's arm and hauled him to his feet. "Run!" We sprinted through the trees, the sounds of those things chasing us growing fainter as we ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but we didn't stop until we saw the faint glow of the campfire through the trees. We stumbled into camp, gasping for breath, collapsing by the fire. Hannah and Maria jumped up, their faces pale with fear. "What happened? Where's Chris?" I looked around, my heart sinking. Chris wasn't with us. He's still out there," Paul managed to say between gasps. "Those things, they took him." The girls stared at us, wide-eyed, not knowing what to say. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. I stood up, my legs shaking. "We need to leave now." Maria shook her head. "What about Chris?" I looked toward the tree line, where the lights had disappeared. My stomach churned. "He's gone." We grabbed our packs, not even bothering to put the fire out, and started hiking back down the trail. None of us said a word, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a heavy fog. I couldn't stop thinking about Chris, about how we had just left him out there, alone with those things. The hike back to the car felt like a blur. Every now and then I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the lights following us. But they didn't. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. By the time we reached the car, the sun was starting to rise, casting a faint glow over the mountains. But the light did nothing to chase away the terror that still clung to me. As we drove away, I looked out the window at the forest, wondering if we'd ever really know what those things were. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. Chris wasn't coming back. Story 17. I've hunted these woods my whole life. I know every trail, every sound, every shadow. But tonight, something was different. Something was hunting me. The first sign was the tracks, massive, clawed prints that shouldn't belong to any creature in these parts. I'd been following a fresh set of deer tracks, rifle in hand, hoping to bag something before the sunset. But those tracks, they stopped me cold. I crouched down, shining my flashlight on the prints, trying to make sense of them. They were too big for a wolf, too long for a bear, and the stride, it was almost human, but distorted, like something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't quite built for it. My stomach knotted with unease. I stood up slowly, scanning the dense trees around me, the fading light casting long shadows. The woods, usually so familiar, felt suddenly alien, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, making my skin crawl. I'd never felt this way out here before, like I didn't belong, like I was being watched. I radioed back to base, a force of habit more than anything. "Hey, base, this is Matt. Found something strange out here. Could use a second set of eyes." "Over." Static. I tried again. "Base, you copy?" Nothing, just a low hum of static, fading in and out like something was messing with the signal. I frowned, tapping the side of the radio. The signal was usually solid this close to the cabin, but maybe the storm clouds moving in were causing interference. I kept walking, slower now, rifle at the ready. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it there was something else, a smell that didn't belong, something metallic, like blood. My pulse quickened. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl from somewhere behind me. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep, guttural and angry. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned, slowly, scanning the tree line with my flashlight, but all I saw were shadows shifting in the dim light of the setting sun. That's when I realized the forest had gone silent. No birds, no wind, no movement, just that oppressive stillness, the kind that sinks into your bones and tells you something's very, very wrong. I started walking faster, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. But then I heard it again, the growl, louder this time, closer, and then footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees. For a moment I saw nothing, just the empty woods, the fog rolling in thick between the trunks. But then, just at the edge of the light, something moved, something tall. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The shape was massive, standing at least 7 or 8 feet tall, hunched over, its limbs unnaturally long and covered in matted, dark fur. Its eyes, glowing a faint, sickly yellow, locked onto mine from across the clearing. My blood ran cold. This was no bear. This was no animal I'd ever seen. It moved with intelligence, stalking, not charging, as if it knew it didn't need to rush. The thing let out another growl, low and rumbling, and took a step forward. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, my mind racing. I'd heard stories, old legends about creatures that roamed these mountains, stories of something people called the Dogman, half-man, half-wolf, a predator that hunts the unwary, but those were just campfire tales, right? Until now. I raised my rifle, hands shaking. The thing stopped, watching me, almost amused. It was playing with me, letting me think I had a chance, but I could see it in its eyes. It knew I was no match for it. I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the woods, deafening in the silence. But when the smoke cleared, the creature was still there, unfazed. I hadn't even hit it. It growled again, this time louder, the sound reverberating through my chest. My legs were jelly, fear clawing up my throat. I was a hunter, damn it, not prey, but right now it didn't feel that way. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the trees, my boots pounding against the earth. The footsteps behind me were steady, unhurried, but they never wavered. It was following me, keeping pace, waiting for the right moment to strike. I ran faster, lungs burning, heart racing. The cabin wasn't far now. If I could just make it there, I'd be safe. The others would hear me. We could barricade the door, radio for help. The footsteps were closer now, the growls louder, more insistent. It was toying with me, enjoying the chase. I could feel its eyes on my back, feel the weight of its presence closing in. The cabin finally came into view through the trees, a dark silhouette against the fading light. I sprinted toward it, my legs screaming with every step, but just as I reached the clearing, the thing let out a howl, long and piercing, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and saw it, its massive form barreling through the trees, its glowing eyes locked on me. I threw myself against the cabin door, fumbling with the latch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the damn thing open. Behind me, the creature's footsteps were thundering now, growing faster, more determined. I yanked the door open and slammed it shut behind me just as something heavy crashed into it, shaking the entire cabin. I bolted the door, my chest heaving, adrenaline pumping through my veins. For a moment, everything went quiet. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then the banging started. The creature was outside, slamming its massive body against the door, growling and snarling. The whole cabin shook with each hit, dust raining down from the rafters. I grabbed my rifle, backing away from the door, my mind racing. There was no way that flimsy door was going to hold. "Come on, come on," I muttered, fumbling with the radio. "Base, do you copy? I need backup. Something's out here, something." Static. God damn it! I slammed the radio down, my hands shaking with fear. The creature howled again, the sound echoing through the cabin, rattling the windows. The door cracked under the pressure, the wood splintering. I could hear it breathing now, heavy and labored, just on the other side. I backed into the far corner of the room, clutching my rifle, knowing it was useless. The door wouldn't hold much longer. I was trapped. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence. I didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe. My heart was pounding in my ears, the cabin still echoing with the memory of that thing's growls. For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl, your muscles tense. And then I heard it, a soft scratching at the window. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. There, just outside the window, was the creature, its massive clawed hand pressed against the glass, its glowing eyes peering inside, watching me. It didn't snarl, didn't growl. It just stared. My heart slammed against my ribs as I raised the rifle again, hands trembling, but I knew it was pointless. It was playing with me, enjoying my fear, savoring the moment. The thing leaned in closer, its breath fogging up the glass, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, with a low, rumbling growl, it stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, rifle raised, waiting for it to come back, waiting for the next attack, but it never came. The creature was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare. I just sat there staring at the door, waiting for the thing to return, but it didn't. By morning the tracks were gone, the forest silent again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was out there, something ancient, something that knew these woods better than I ever could, and it was still watching, waiting. Story 18. The first howl could have been a wolf. The second made my skin crawl. By the third, I knew we were dealing with something far beyond my training as a park ranger, and far more dangerous than any natural predator. My name's Jack, and I've been a ranger at Blackwood National Park for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all. Lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional drug operation hidden deep in the woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in the oldest part of the forest. It started with reports of strange noises near the abandoned Campbell campground. We'd closed it years ago, after a series of unexplained disappearances, but hikers passing through the area had been complaining about eerie howls and an oppressive sense of being watched. Normally, I'd write it off as overactive imaginations fueled by campfire stories. But the frequency of the reports and the genuine fear I saw in people's eyes as they described their experiences made me take notice. I decided to investigate personally, heading out just before dusk. The plan was to camp overnight, see if I could hear these mysterious sounds for myself. Looking back, I realize how naive that was. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The hike to the old campground was uneventful, the forest peaceful in the fading light. But as I neared the site, an unnatural silence fell. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. The campground itself was a sorry sight, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. Rotting picnic tables, overgrown fire pits, the rusted skeleton of an old playground. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Night fell quickly, the darkness beneath the ancient trees absolute. I built a small fire, its flickering light creating more shadows than illumination. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. That's when I heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a wolf or any animal I'd ever encountered. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a primal jolt of fear through my body. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness beyond my campfire. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and frightened in the vast silence of the forest. Another howl answered, closer this time. It was followed by another, then another, until the night was filled with an otherworldly chorus that made my blood run cold. Movement caught my eye at the edge of the firelight. I swung my flashlight towards it, heart pounding. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, tall and misshapen, wearing what looked like an animal skull as a mask. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows with unnatural speed. I reached for my radio with shaking hands, ready to call for backup. But before I could key the mic, a new sound cut through the night, chanting, low and guttural, in a language I'd never heard before. The chanting grew louder, and with it came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them moving with purpose through the underbrush. They were surrounding me. Panic took over. I abandoned my camp, plunging into the darkness of the forest. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, their movements unnaturally quiet, save for that ceaseless chanting. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare chase. But eventually I burst into a clearing and skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. Before me was a crude stone altar, ancient and weathered. It was surrounded by standing stones, each carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the moonlight. The air hummed with an energy I could feel in my bones, making my skin prickle and my thoughts fuzzy. But it was what lay on the altar that turned my blood to ice. A body, or what was left of one. It had been torn apart, its limbs arranged in a grotesque pattern that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This was beyond anything I'd been trained for, beyond anything I thought possible. That's when they emerged from the trees. They moved like humans, but there was something profoundly wrong about their gait, their proportions. Each wore an animal's skull as a mask, deer, bear, wolf, hiding whatever faces might lie beneath. Their bodies were adorned with tattoos that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, shifting and changing as I watched. They formed a circle around me, their chanting rising to a fevered pitch. I could feel the vibrations of it in my chest, making it hard to breathe, to think. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, wearing the skull of some great predator I couldn't identify. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel and thunder. "Welcome, Watcher. We've been expecting you." I tried to respond, but no words would come. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. "For too long we have been forgotten," the leader continued. "The old ways abandoned, the old gods left to starve. But no more. Tonight we complete the ritual. Tonight we open the way." As if on cue, the others began to sway, their chanting taking on a rhythmic quality that made my head spin. The symbols on the standing stones flared to life, pulsing in time with the chant. I knew I should run, fight, do something. But my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, a helpless observer to whatever madness was unfolding. The leader raised a wickedly curved knife, its blade glinting red in the moonlight. "The sacrifice has been prepared," it intoned. "The gate is ready to open. All we need now is the key." With a sinking horror, I realized what, or rather who, the key was. As the leader advanced towards me, knife raised, a small, rational part of my brain finally kick-started into action. I reached for my belt, fumbling for my pepper spray. It was a pitiful defense against whatever these things were, but it was all I had. Just as the leader's hand closed around my arm, I raised the pepper spray and emptied the entire canister into the eye holes of its skull mask. The effect was instantaneous and far more dramatic than I could have hoped. The creature reared back with an inhuman shriek, clawing at its mask. The chanting faltered, the pulsing symbols flickering like a faulty neon sign. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, crashing through the circle of cultists and into the dark forest beyond. Behind me, I could hear shrieks of rage and the sounds of pursuit, but blind terror lent me speed I didn't know I possessed. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me was unfamiliar, the trees twisted into shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. For hours, I wandered in a daze, jumping at every shadow and sound. As dawn finally broke, I stumbled onto a hiking trail I recognized. By some miracle, I'd made it back to a part of the park I knew. I've tried to report what I saw that night, but who would believe me? My official report cites an illegal gathering, possible drug use, nothing more. But I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, ancient and hungry things that lurk in the dark places. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. I still work as a ranger, but I never patrol alone anymore, especially not at night. And if hikers report strange noises or feelings of being watched, I make sure those areas are closed off, no questions asked, because I know now that the veil between our world and something else is thinner than we think. And there are those who would tear it down entirely, heedless of the consequences. So let me give you some advice from someone who's seen behind that veil. If you're out in the wilderness and you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, see something that doesn't quite fit, trust your instincts. Don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Run, and don't look back, because sometimes the monsters are real. And they're always hungry. Story 19. The first pair of eyes I saw reflecting in the firelight didn't scare me. It was the dozens that followed, surrounding our camp in a silent, hungry circle that turned our camping trip into a waking nightmare. My name's Chris, and I've been an avid camper since I was a kid. I thought I'd seen it all. Bears, mountain lions, even a particularly angry badger once. But nothing could have prepared me for what my friends and I encountered in the backcountry of the Ozarks. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just 4 friends looking to escape the city and enjoy some nature. Me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike and Lisa. We'd chosen a remote spot, miles from the nearest marked trail, the kind of place where you can really feel alone in the wilderness, or so we thought. The hike-in was beautiful. Autumn leaves crunching underfoot and the crisp air filled with the scent of pine. We set up camp in a small clearing near a babbling creek, the perfect spot for some R&R. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and trading stories, the usual camping trip stuff. Looking back, I realize how naive we were, how unprepared for what was watching us from the darkness. It was Mike who first noticed something was off. He kept glancing over his shoulder, peering into the shadows beyond our firelight. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. We fell silent, straining our ears. At first, all I could hear were the normal nighttime forest sounds, the crackle of our fire, the gentle rush of the creek, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then I heard it, a soft rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. And was that breathing? "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But something about the quality of that sound set my nerves on edge. Sarah scooted closer to me, her eyes wide in the firelight. "I don't like this, Chris," she whispered. I put my arm around her, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "It's fine," I assured her. "We're perfectly safe." That's when I saw the eyes, 2 pinpricks of reflected firelight glowing an eerie yellowish green in the darkness. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest creature. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the eyes were still there. And they weren't alone. All around our campsite, just beyond the reach of our fire, pairs of eyes began to appear. Dozens of them, all staring at us with an unnervingly intelligent hunger. "Oh, God," Lisa breathed, her marshmallow dropping forgotten from her stick. Mike stood up slowly, reaching for the hatchet we'd used to split firewood earlier. "What the hell are those things?" I shook my head, my mouth dry. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here now." We moved with frantic energy, shoving sleeping bags into packs and collapsing tents. All the while, those eyes watched us, unblinking. Occasionally, something would move in the shadows, giving us glimpses of shapes that were almost human, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Just as we were shouldering our packs, ready to flee, a new sound froze us in place. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like no animal I'd ever heard. Part wolf, part big cat, but with an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Now!" We plunged into the darkness, headlamps bobbing wildly as we crashed through the underbrush. Behind us, I could hear them giving chase, their movements almost silent save for the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. I lost all sense of direction as we ran. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Whenever we'd start to slow, another growl would sound, closer than before, spurring us on. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare chase. But eventually, we burst out of the tree line and onto a gravel road. "There!" Mike shouted, pointing to a ramshackle building 100 yards down the road. "A ranger station." We sprinted towards it, relief flooding through me at the sight of the faded Park Service logo. As we neared the building, a light flicked on inside, the door opened, and a figure stepped out, shotgun in hand. "What in tarnation!" the ranger exclaimed as we skidded to a stop in front of him, gasping for breath. "Please," Sarah panted. "You have to help us. There's something out there. Something's chasing us." The ranger's eyes narrowed as he peered past us into the darkness. "Something, you say? What did it look like?" I shook my head, still struggling to catch my breath. We didn't really see them clearly. Just eyes. Dozens of eyes. A strange look passed over the ranger's face. Not disbelief, as I'd expected, but something more like grim recognition. "Inside," he said gruffly, ushering us through the door. "Quick now." Once we were all in, he slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Then he moved from window to window, closing heavy wooden shutters and securing them with iron bars. "Sit," he ordered, gesturing to a cluster of chairs. "Catch your breath. Then you're going to tell me exactly what you saw out there." As we collapsed into the chairs, I took in our surroundings. The station was small but sturdy, more like a frontier outpost than a modern ranger station. Maps covered one wall, marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. The other walls were lined with an eclectic array of weapons, everything from modern rifles to what looked like honest-to-God swords. "What is this place?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. The ranger ignored her question, instead fixing us with an intense stare. "Now then," he said, "start at the beginning, and don't leave anything out, no matter how strange it might seem." We took turns recounting our experience, from the first uneasy feelings to the chase through the woods. As we spoke, the ranger's expression grew increasingly grim. When we finished, he sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older. "You folks are lucky," he said. "Not many who encounter the night hunters live to tell about it." "Night hunters," Mike repeated. "What are you talking about?" The ranger was silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much to tell us. Finally, he spoke. "There are things in these woods that ain't natural," he said slowly. "Things that have been here long before us, and'll be here long after we're gone. Most folks never see them, never know they exist. But sometimes, if you're real unlucky, you catch their attention." He stood, moving to a locked cabinet. From it, he withdrew an old leather-bound book. "This here's been passed down through my family for generations," he explained, carefully opening the tome. It tells of the things that lurk in the dark places of the world, the things most people pretend don't exist. He turned the book towards us. On the yellowed pages were intricate drawings of creatures that defied description, part animal, part human, wholly terrifying. The night hunters are among the oldest, the ranger continued. They hunt in packs, using their prey's fear to drive them to exhaustion. They're cunning, patient, and they're always hungry. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the illustrations. They matched all too well with the glimpses we'd caught in the forest. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice small. The ranger closed the book with a snap. "We wait. The hunters won't approach the station. Too many wards and protections. Come morning, I'll escort you folks back to your vehicle." He must have seen the fear in our eyes, because his expression softened slightly. "Don't worry," he said. "You're safe here. But let this be a lesson to you. There are parts of the wilderness humans weren't meant to tread, places we don't belong." We spent a sleepless night in that strange outpost, jumping at every sound from the forest outside. When dawn finally broke, the ranger, true to his word, led us back to our car. We didn't see any sign of the night hunters in the daylight, but I could feel their eyes on us the whole way. I still go camping, but never in that part of the Ozarks. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear those inhuman growls in the distance. So let me give you some advice. If you're out in the wilderness and you see eyes watching you from the darkness, eyes that don't look quite right, don't investigate, don't try to be brave, run, and don't look back, because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're always hungry. Story 20. The roar that echoed through the cave wasn't from any bear I'd ever heard. It was deeper, angrier, and unmistakably inhuman, and it was coming straight for us. My name's Alex, and I've been a winter camping enthusiast for years. I thought I'd seen it all: blizzards, avalanches, even a close encounter with a hungry wolf pack. But nothing could have prepared me for what my friends and I stumbled upon in that remote mountain cave. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, just 3 friends testing our skills against the harsh winter wilderness. Me, my longtime camping buddy Mark, and his girlfriend Sarah, who was new to winter camping but eager to learn. We'd chosen a challenging route in the Rockies, far from the usual tourist spots. The kind of place where you can go days without seeing another human soul. The forecast called for heavy snow, but we were prepared. Or so we thought. The first 2 days were tough but exhilarating. We trudged through knee-deep snow, set up camp in howling winds, and marveled at the pristine beauty of the winter landscape. On the 3rd morning, we woke to find the world transformed. A blizzard had blown in overnight, burying our tent and obliterating any sign of our tracks. "We need to find shelter," Mark shouted over the howling wind as we broke camp. "This storm's worse than predicted." I nodded, squinting through the swirling snow. Visibility was down to almost nothing, but I thought I remembered seeing a rocky outcropping about a mile back. "There might be a cave system in those cliffs we passed yesterday," I yelled back. "It's our best shot." We set off, fighting against the wind with every step. The cold was brutal, seeping through our layers despite our high-tech gear. Sarah stumbled more than once, unused to moving in such deep snow. Mark and I took turns breaking trail, but it was slow, exhausting work. After what felt like hours, the dark shape of the cliffs loomed out of the whiteout. Hope surged through me as I spotted a dark opening at the base, a cave entrance, just large enough for us to squeeze through. "Thank God!" Sarah gasped as we huddled just inside the entrance, shaking snow from our clothes. "I thought we were goners out there." I pulled out my headlamp, switching it on to examine our shelter. The beam illuminated a surprisingly large cavern, extending far back into the mountain. The air was still and noticeably warmer than outside, a welcome relief from the howling storm. "This is perfect," Mark said, already shrugging off his pack. "We can wait out the storm here, no problem." We set up our camp, grateful for the protection of the cave. As Sarah got a small stove going to heat some soup, I decided to explore a bit further back, curious about the extent of the cave system. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dusty cave floor, partially obscured by fallen rocks but unmistakable. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, and shaped like no animal print I'd ever seen. "Guys!" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "You need to see this." Mark joined me, his brow furrowing as he examined the prints. "What the hell made these?" he muttered. Sarah hung back, her eyes wide. Maybe we should find somewhere else to camp," she said, her voice shaky. I was about to agree when a gust of wind extinguished our stove, plunging us into darkness save for my headlamp. And in that sudden silence, we heard it. A low, rumbling growl coming from deeper within the cave. We froze, straining our ears. The growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. "Back to the entrance," I whispered, gesturing frantically. "Now!" We scrambled to gather our gear, moving as quietly as we could. But we weren't quiet enough. A roar shook the cavern, so loud it made my ears ring, and then we saw it, illuminated in the beam of my headlamp. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a shaggy coat of white fur that blended perfectly with the snowy landscape outside. But it was the face that stopped my heart, a twisted blend of bear and ape-like features, with eyes that glowed an unnatural blue in the darkness. "Oh my God," Sarah whimpered. The creature roared again, showing rows of yellowed fangs. Then it charged. We ran, blind panic giving us speed. But the monster was faster, its massive strides eating up the distance between us. I could hear its labored breathing, feel the heat of it on the back of my neck. Just as we reached the cave entrance, a massive hand closed around my ankle. I went down hard, snow and rocks scraping my face. I rolled over to see the creature looming over me, its hot, rancid breath fogging in the cold air. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then Mark was there, swinging his ice axe with all his might. The pick caught the monster in the shoulder, drawing a shriek of pain and rage. Its grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled away. "Run!" Mark yelled, taking another swing at the creature. We burst out of the cave into the raging blizzard. The wind nearly knocked us off our feet, the cold a shock after the relative warmth of the cavern. But fear drove us on. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Only when we could no longer hear the creature's roars over the howling wind did we dare to stop. What was that thing?" Sarah gasped, doubled over and retching in the snow. I shook my head, still struggling to process what I'd seen. "I don't know. Some kind of yeti," Mark finished, his face pale beneath his frost-caked beard. "We just saw a goddamn yeti." Under different circumstances, I might have laughed at the idea, but the memory of those glowing eyes, that twisted face, was too fresh, too real. We kept moving, pushing through the storm on sheer adrenaline. By some miracle, we stumbled onto a Forest Service road just as darkness was falling. An hour later, a passing snowplow picked us up, saving us from certain death in the wilderness. We told the authorities about the cave, claiming we'd been attacked by a bear. Who would believe the truth? But they must have found something strange, because the entire area was closed off for geological surveys shortly after. I still go winter camping, but never in that part of the Rockies. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that inhuman roar. I've spent countless hours researching since then, poring over old legends and cryptid sightings. I've found enough similarities to make me believe we're not alone in our experience. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy explanation. So let me give you some advice, from someone who's seen behind the veil of what we think we know about nature. If you're out in the wilderness and you find tracks you can't identify, hear sounds that raise the hair on the back of your neck. Trust your instincts. Don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Just get out of there as fast as you can, because sometimes the monsters in our campfire stories are real. They're out there, watching and waiting in the dark and frozen places of the world, and they're hungry, always, always hungry.